So hello and welcome to everyone on the live stream and of course those of you who are here in person. This is the 2024 NTIA Spectrum Policy Symposium. My name is Scott Harris. I am NTIA's Senior Spectrum Advisor and your host for the morning session. We have a truly great program for you today. Though I was told that as the morning host, it was incumbent upon me to tell a joke about Spectrum. So this is not so easy, it turns out. Spectrum is not funny. But I did research. I found a joke. Should I do it? Yes. Okay, all right, so I want to make sure. Have you heard about the wedding of the two antennas? The ceremony wasn't much, but the reception was great. Right? Come on, really? Okay, now we're in the mood to get going. While Spectrum may not be inherently funny, it is a particularly hot topic now. As you will see, we have extraordinary speakers and panelists with us today, and this room is packed, and I hear the live stream has lots and lots of attendees. The theme of this year's symposium is implementation of the National Spectrum Strategy. As NTIA's Senior Spectrum Advisor and the Director of the National Strategy, it is absolutely thrilling for me to see the high level of interest in the strategy as we move forward into the critical implementations phase. Our leadoff speaker, NTIA Administrator Alan Davidson, deserves much of the credit for developing the National Spectrum Strategy. As the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications Information, Alan really and truly has worked tirelessly to bring together government and private sector stakeholders to produce the strategy, while at the same time intending to NTIA's stunningly broad portfolio of other issues, including Internet for All, artificial intelligence, Open RAN, FirstNet, and I could actually do that for about 5 minutes, but I won't because we're short for time. So with all of that, let me welcome my friend, my boss, Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Scott. And the person who really deserves a round of applause right now is Scott Harris, the architect of all of this here for us. And thank you, Scott, for what you've been doing. And I heard the joke, and all I can say is you all asked for it. So I'll say thank you all for joining us for this the sixth Spectrum Symposium by NTIA. We have an excellent lineup of speakers today. We're so thrilled to have them representing a full range of stakeholder views on the various topics we're going to be discussing. But first, I have to say I am really excited to be able to bring you a video from my boss, Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. Secretary Raimondo has been, I just have to say, a champion. It really has been a champion of smart spectrum policy since even before joining the department. It was actually in her confirmation hearing that she first called for a national spectrum strategy. And her support and leadership, I have to just say, has been in many, many ways hard to even recount, just instrumental in our ability to get the national spectrum strategy done and to our success in this space generally. So, and now, a word from our fearless leader, Secretary Raimondo. Let's see if this works.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 NTIA Spectrum Policy Symposium. My top priority as Secretary of Commerce is to make our country more competitive. So we're investing billions of dollars to make that happen. We're building a domestic semiconductor industry, jump-starting high-tech manufacturing, and connecting everyone in America to reliable, high-speed internet. And it's why we're driving forward President Biden's Investing in America agenda, supercharging our tech ecosystem and spurring private investment in communities all across the country. It's why we must continue to promote innovation in wireless technology, because our economic security, and even more important, our national security, depend on continuing America's technological leadership. Spectrum is a finite resource. But America has proven that the only real limit is our imagination. Spectrum's helped us to explore space and predict the weather. It's been the driving force behind trillions of dollars in economic growth. The importance of spectrum can't be overstated, and expanding spectrum access will only grow in importance as AI, robotics, supercomputing, and more data-reliant technologies take center stage. So that's why President Biden called for a national spectrum strategy, a long-term vision for modernizing our approach to spectrum and maximizing its benefits. The strategy we released last November is ambitious, forward-looking, and exactly what we need at this moment. It identifies a pipeline of more than 2,700 megahertz to study for innovative new uses, nearly double our initial target. It establishes a framework for long-term planning, boost research into spectrum sharing technologies, and will help us grow the spectrum workforce. It's a remarkable achievement, and I am so grateful to Alan Davidson and his team at NTIA for their incredible work. But as we all know, collaboration is at the heart of spectrum management. Frankly, we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the openness and dedication of our federal partners across the government, and the private sector, and local and tribal governments, the scientific community, and many more who've lent their time and expertise to this effort. Thank you to everyone joining us today for working with us. Of course, our work is not nearly finished. Just because we have a strategy, now comes the real work, the even bigger challenge, implementation. And that's the focus of today's symposium. The only way to meet the goals we've laid out is to work together. If we do, I know we will unleash economic growth, fuel innovation, and cement America's technological leadership for decades to come. And I know we can do just that. Thank you.
As you've heard, this is an exciting time for spectrum policy. And the conversations we're going to have today they give us vital feedback that we need as we're developing the implementation plan for the National Spectrum Strategy. As the Secretary said, it's now all about implementation. She's a big fan of execution, as those of us in the department can attest. And that's where we are now, executing on this plan. A few words just from me too on this. You know, we're here because of the importance of spectrum. I don't really need to tell all of you if you're here, but you all know this. But I think a lot of people in America don't understand the critical, if unseen, role that spectrum plays in our daily lives. And earlier this month, I was actually out at the Consumer Electronics Show, and everybody was talking this year about, there's always a theme for the show, and this year the theme seemed to be like, you know, AI in everything, like every device, you know, your refrigerator and your pet dish, you know, for food, or what, everything's gonna have AI, right? But I've been going to this show long enough to sort of remember the time when all of those devices were actually not connected. And really, I think, while there's a lot of talk about AI and everything, there's a lot of questions about how long it's gonna take to actually get there. To me, the enduring theme of this was that we just demand a lot more from all of the devices in our lives. We demand that they are intelligent. We demand that they, you know, make use of data. And what powers all of that is connectivity. We demand now that everything in our lives is connected. It's weird when it's not. And we all know that what powers that is spectrum. And so the big takeaway for me was spectrum everywhere, connectivity everywhere, and what we're doing here is what powers that revolution. You know, the demand is only growing, and I think you all are here because we all know this. From 6G cellular systems on the horizon to advanced Wi-Fi, satellite mega constellations, consumers have come to expect connectivity at a scale and scope that we're only just scratching the surface of today. Spectrum access is going to be essential for federal missions. The same demands that are driving the private sector, more data, more intelligence, more connectivity, they drive demand in the federal missions as well. And we're going to see it from a return to the moon to managing the crowded airspace and everything in between. We're only going to meet this demand with a coherent long-term strategy. The low-hanging fruit is gone. The easy answers in this space are past us. So a strategy is essential, and one that offers more certainty to industry and to agencies alike, that supports innovation, and that's driven by science and evidence. That is what will position the U.S. to lead the way internationally. And we're here to discuss that strategy and move it forward. The National Spectrum Strategy will help meet our nation's spectrum needs, harness innovation, build economic and national security for years to come, if we do it right. The strategy charts a whole-of-government approach to achieving those goals, and today's symposium is all about making that approach a reality. We asked for and received over 75 public comments on implementing the strategy, and today we will hear from many of the experts about the challenges and opportunities to come. Our keynote speakers are going to speak to the major objectives of the strategy and how it will help us achieve national objectives in innovation, economic growth, and national security. And we've broken down the day in 4 panel discussions that each reflect a pillar of the strategy as we've laid it out. And we're planning to bring together government and private sector experts to help break down how we implement each of those goals. So first, we'll have a set of panelists who will discuss the 2,700 megahertz of spectrum that we've identified for potential new uses by the private sector and federal agencies. Next, we'll hear feedback on the creation of an enduring framework to bring together stakeholders for proactive spectrum planning. I think this is an area where we know we can do better, and the kind of conversations like we're having today, where we bring together a wide variety of stakeholders, those have proven invaluable, and we really want to double down on how we do that better. Third, we'll have a panel that will discuss how to spur investment in new technologies, particularly dynamic spectrum sharing. We know that we have to make better use of the airwaves. Technology can help us here. Fourth, we'll explore the 4th pillar of the strategy, which is the creation of a national spectrum workforce plan. We need to grow the ecosystem of spectrum experts. Like the workforce surge that we've seen or tried to create in cybersecurity and now in artificial intelligence, the plan, the National Spectrum Strategy, reflects our nation's need to grow the ranks of spectrum technologists. And that's going to be essential if we're going to succeed in the future. And finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion focused on the role of our White House colleagues in all of these issues. So as you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to need your help in all of this work as we go forward. As challenging as it was to deliver the strategy, the National Spectrum Strategy, is really just the start of the work ahead, as the Secretary said. We're asking for your continued engagement, for spectrum stakeholders from the diverse set of industries that rely on spectrum, from academics across the country, from federal agency leaders. The U.S. right now is in the midst of an intense competition, a competition for global leadership in the wireless space. We need to be smart, we need to be strategic, we need to be science-based, and most importantly, we need to work together if we're going to meet that global challenge. And that's what this national strategy is all about. In the months and years to come, it will be up to all of us to shepherd the strategy's objectives so that they become reality. It's going to take a lot of work. We need everyone to do their part. So I just want to say thank you for your partnership. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being here today. And I know that we can make this strategy a reality working together. So, thank you. So I'm very happy now to introduce our first keynote speaker, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Don Graves. And I will just say, Deputy Secretary Graves, besides being an enormously decent human being and an incredible leader for the Department of Commerce, he is somebody who cares deeply about spectrum issues. And he's been passionate about this topic since I arrived at the Commerce Department. And you know, it takes a lot to get these these strategies across the finish line. Those of you who are familiar with intergovernment, the processes within government, often conversations between agencies end up at what we call a deputies committee. I will say a lot of this strategy got hashed out in deputies committee meetings, and we were so fortunate as a department, and I think we're so fortunate as a community to have as a leader in those conversations for us, this Deputy Secretary. So please join me in welcoming Deputy Secretary Don Graves.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. Actually, I've been doing this work in part since the Telecommunications Act of 1996, when I was a young lawyer working on some of these very same issues. So it's, I'm not an expert like you are, but I've been in and around the space for a while. Good morning, everyone. It is really great to see this group. I want to thank you all for joining us today and allowing me to speak with you a bit about the implementation of our efforts, the Biden-Harris administration's groundbreaking efforts, to build and execute on what Alan and the Secretary talked about, the national security strategy, and really to secure the future of U.S. leadership in wireless communications. Our national spectrum strategy, did I say national security strategy the first time? National spectrum strategy, almost the same thing, really. Our national spectrum strategy is essential to maximizing our economic and national security, and a major priority for the Department of Commerce, for the Secretary, and for myself. The strategy is reimagining and reshaping spectrum policy and the management of spectrum resources for what I think will be decades to come. You all know that it's unleashing America's potential, our technological ingenuity, and our prowess through new services, new wireless services, improved government operations. But make no mistake, spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless communications and one of the country's most precious resources, period. Not only is it integral to functioning in the present, it's the key to securing our future. You will hear that over and over again if you didn't know that already. Spectrum is powering unprecedented levels of economic growth. Over the next decade, it could add up to trillions of dollars. The growth will not just help the U.S. maintain its status as a global leader in technological innovation, but, help safeguard our national security. The U.S. is engaged in a high-stakes, must-win competition. It's critical that we focus on this, on spectrum, on emerging technologies, because there are adversarial nations all across the globe who are challenging us on all of these fronts. And spectrum is at the center of all of it. As we speak, China, for instance, is launching a concerted effort to dominate 5G deployment and the eventual deployment of 6G. Our own spectrum policy needs to overcome all of these efforts and ensure that the U.S. and our partners and allies can compete globally on a level global playing field. President Biden gets this. It's something that he believes in deeply, and it's reflected in the meaningful actions that this entire administration has taken to continue to do the work on focusing on addressing the challenges, but positioning us for leadership in the future. We've made historic investments, and Alan's talked a little bit about this, and you will undoubtedly hear more about the things that we're doing from our connectivity efforts with the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, the BEAD program, with the $42.45, almost $42.5 billion from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Additionally, the Wireless Innovation Fund, which I think is one of the most crucial programs that we have in government, which is helping us to maintain U.S. leadership in wireless technology, providing $1.5 billion to build and sustain a flourishing network of open, interoperable, and standards-based networks. It's really seeding the ecosystem. It will create a proving grounds, if you will, for the U.S. and for our partners around the world. These are just two, I think, strong examples of the timely, important work that we've been doing. And as we look to advance these and other efforts, the need for forward-looking spectrum management is absolutely critical. You've already heard that spectrum is a finite resource. I'm sure most of you know that already. The careful allocation of spectrum and decisions made by the U.S. spectrum managers, they've enabled us to have decades of U.S. technological and innovation leadership. And that same level of care, that strategic thinking, needs to be carried forward into the future. That makes it so much more necessary that we work together to find the right balance of spectrum use. I say that, work together to find the right balance of spectrum use and to create the incentives for investment and research and development. Creating this balance of spectrum requires careful planning, focus, and coordination, a common vision that will help us navigate the roadmap of responsible spectrum management. That vision includes all of you. You are essential to ensuring that we make the right decisions for our competitiveness going forward. We need help from stakeholders like you who understand the urgency of the moment and the significance of spectrum in driving this country's security, our prosperity, and our leadership forward. We need your partnership, we need your engagement to make the National Spectrum Strategy a success. We need your expertise and your skills to help build an economy that works for everyone and a national defense that safeguards all Americans. Our future depends on that. So, again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your partnership. We're really looking forward to working together with you going forward. Hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Just say many thanks to the Deputy Secretary. As you can see, we're very lucky at the Commerce Department to have leadership who's deeply invested in these issues. Our next speaker, yes, she's here. Let me just start by saying I can safely say that without the help of and leadership of our next speaker, we would not have accomplished nearly as much as we did with the National Spectrum Strategy. Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger has had really a forward-looking vision, a vision that's unusual, I think, in these roles, to see the connection between our national security and the availability of spectrum for our commercial sector, the tie-in between national security and economic security. She's been a real leader, both inside the government and outside, in articulating that connection. And I will say a deeply effective and respected driver, ensuring that we're able to meet the needs of the private sector and of federal agencies in this space. And I can say that she is someone who cares deeply about the long-term health of our technology sector and the safety of our telecommunications networks. She is committed to American leadership in both, and I'll just say, in this process of creating a national spectrum strategy, we have benefited enormously from her leadership. So it's my honor to welcome to the stage Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here today. Thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. I've greatly appreciated the partnership during the development of the National Spectrum Strategy. There is nothing like sitting in a room with the door closed to get hard issues resolved, right? And spectrum is, as Alan put it, sometimes a particularly challenging one. It's core to our leadership in wireless technologies, which whether one is sitting at a Starbucks working remotely using Wi-Fi, whether during COVID we saw the difference in communications and access that different children had based on what part of the country they're in, and whether it's based on the future, including things like UAVs monitoring electricity infrastructure after a storm to pinpoint where maintenance is most needed and needs to happen. For that to happen, both for our leadership and for the economic impact, the largest user of spectrum, which is, this group knows well, the US government has to really get on board and be a thoughtful part of leveraging new technologies, new ways to share, and that broader understanding that both our future economic strength and our national security strength in this space are fundamentally intertwined. So first, to the NTIA, under Alan's leadership, congratulations on the National Spectrum Strategy. I want to first recognize and congratulate the prior speaker, Don Graves, who's a key partner on so many telecommunications and national security issues across the administration. Of course, Alan Davidson. Really, NTIA's work has become more important than ever, more forward-looking than ever, and that's very much reflected in the work here. I think anyone who's been involved in the development of a national level strategy knows that these aren't done every year. So they're meant to be forward-looking in a way that sets guidelines for where we want to go. And that was very much the goal for this one, as well as the timing was very intentional. Because fundamentally, we're in a strategic competition with the PRC, and because it's the only country in the world that has both the intent and the capability to reshape the international order, and increasingly the power to do it. And since we believe that advanced networks are the digital infrastructure that will decide whether we stay ahead in this competition, this is a priority for us, because this infrastructure, as I said, is the essential platform. You know, as we think back 100 years ago to the age of the telegraph and the railroad, those were the two elements of our national strength, the ability to communicate across a vast country, the ability to move goods across a vast country, so that both American production and American intellectual property could help ensure that we led on the economic stage, and I might say our values of equality, our values of an open door to people from all over the world could be leading as well. And those really, the telegraph and the railroad provided that infrastructure. Today, a big part of that is wireless devices and connected devices, because those have really supplanted many of those legacy networks. And as we look to the future, we see all the areas of promise. Some of the programs NTIA is running, for example, ensuring that every family, every child across the country has the digital access to learn so they can compete in a future economy. They can be on the cutting edge in terms of their own knowledge and their own ability to contribute to a global economy. I mentioned the opportunity of UAV networks to monitor our infrastructure, satellite communications to ensure that emergency responders, wherever they are, have comms that they could rely on. And we know that we can't see that future without sufficient access to spectrum. And unless the United States has a forward-looking policy on spectrum, we won't be able to build that next generation infrastructure that we need to stay ahead. And we know that that's fundamental not only to areas, examples I gave, like access for emergency responders, but also to autonomous cars and the future we see of cars being able to communicate so people can drive more safely, to charging infrastructure so we can guide how folks, where we build out that charging infrastructure for optimal commuting times and the data of knowing when people commute and where. And certainly the military communications that keep us safe. Our national security enterprise fundamentally relies on secure, consistent, guaranteed communication. And that's global. And we know that a big part of that is certainly access in the US to spectrum for technologies like missile defense, but also the ability to test many of those platforms that are deployed around the world. Sorry, like many in DC, I'm fighting a cold. As you know, one of the challenges we face in spectrum policy is that spectrum is congested and contested. We're largely out of the most easily, most effectively used spectrum. There's no easy bands that don't have current users. And we know we don't have an option to fail. We must lead, we must maintain our leadership in wireless technologies, we must maintain that promise of what global communications can do. So the US government, as the biggest user of spectrum, has to lead in solving this issue. So as a result, the White House established an interagency process that included NTIA, the FCC, DoD, the intelligence community, and a broader set of agencies. You know, in the beginning, the State Department said, why do I need to be in a spectrum process? And the answer was because it's core to our ability to compete with China in wireless communications. And we knew that the UN's wireless conference, the once in 4 years World Radio Conference, was happening that would continue to set the stage for global standards and global development, and that our national spectrum strategy had to come out before, so the U.S. was laying out a vision for allies and partners to rally around at that once in 4 year conference, so we could put our views on the global stage. So I'll highlight some parts of the National Spectrum Strategy, although I suspect that if any group has read it, it's probably this one. While the strategy contains many elements, two critical components. First, there is a pipeline of spectrum to ensure that there will be new spectrum made available. And second, it includes a dynamic spectrum sharing effort to ensure that we're using spectrum most efficiently. Studies. Regarding the spectrum pipeline, we've identified more than 2,700 megahertz of spectrum for in-depth, near-term study to complete in under 2 years. And that's important, because folks look at it and go, studies? Are those open-ended studies? They're not. They need to be completed within 2 years. This is the most ambitious spectrum study goal to date. And in those 2,700 megahertz, there's a mix of bands, because the mix of new technologies we're aiming for, from UAVs to satellite to wireless broadband. One part of our spectrum future is certainly creative and consistent approaches to sharing that are economical, that can be relied on by the private sector. So regarding that dynamic spectrum sharing, we announced an effort to use advanced technologies, such as AI and edge computing, to enable government agencies such as DoD, who use spectrum as a critical resource for many different military platforms, while also creating opportunities for commercial users to have access to spectrum they may not have now. So working in partnership with industry, we're committed to making significant, measurable progress on that goal in the next 10 to 16 months. So in closing, there are significant advantages to the U.S. making spectrum available for the next generation of technologies. And from the President on down, we are committed to doing so. Given the size of the U.S. economy, the history of our technological leadership in wireless technologies, this positions us to be a global leader in this next and even more critical stage. Because spectrum fundamentally not only connects, it protects people around the world. So our global leadership in the 21st century really relies on that. And we're grateful for your partnership. We're grateful for you being here today. We're grateful for the voice of the private sector in leading in innovation, the innovation we need not only for our consumers, but for our national security technologies. And we're grateful really for your innovative thinking on creative ways for us to use spectrum more efficiently, to share more effectively, so that we can ensure that American technology continues to be not only a leader in usability and security, but a leader as a force for good around the world. So thank you again to NTIA for inviting me to be here today, and for the partnership. I wish you a wonderful and productive symposium. Thank you.
So thank you, Anne, for your remarks and for your leadership in the National Security Council. As you can probably tell from Anne's remarks, the NSC has been completely instrumental in our efforts to create a national spectrum strategy and to ensure that it represents a balanced approach to both economic and national security. I'd also like to thank Secretary Raimondo, Deputy Secretary Graves, and Assistant Secretary Davidson for starting off the symposium this morning. Now, I actually insisted on being allowed to come back to the stage to introduce our next guest. It's my pleasure to introduce a distinguished colleague, and for me, more importantly, a longtime friend, Ana Gomez. I hope she won't mind me saying this, but, you know, got to tell the truth. Ana and I first met at the FCC 30 years ago, right? Now, she may deny it, but it was really and truly 30 years ago. She has, though, unlike me, really made good use of her time over the last 30 years. She has worked pretty much everywhere it is possible to work in the telecom sector. In addition to working at the Commission 2 or 3 different times, she's worked at NTIA, she's worked in the White House, she's worked at the State Department, and she's worked in the private sector. The one thing I can tell you is that I always knew she was going to end up as an FCC commissioner. Anna, if you would come up and say hi to everyone. Thank you.
Scott. Thank you, Scott. That was such a nice introduction.
The 30 years was okay?
It's actually true. So I can't hide from the truth. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to NTIA's annual Spectrum Policy Symposium. It is very nice to return to my old kind of home, since we're at the press club, and an honor to participate in this critical conversation alongside key federal partners. As Scott mentioned, I'm the newest commissioner at the FCC, and I previously served as NTIA's deputy administrator, and as he also mentioned, most recently served at the Department of State, where I led our nation's preparations for the International Telecommunication Union World Radio Communication Conference. So I offer my remarks from this unique perspective of having been in leadership positions at each of the federal agencies that play a key role in our nation's spectrum policy. And my key message is this: collaboration leads to good policy. First, we need a cooperative and collaborative framework where agencies work together to identify additional spectrum for new innovative uses. The good news here is NTIA is already on the task. The National Spectrum Strategy is the culmination of a mutual effort by many, including the NTIA and the FCC, that began 2 years ago as an initiative to shore up coordination and communications between our agencies and, by extension, all federal agencies. This also included updating the memorandum of understanding between our agencies and increasing meetings at policy and technical levels, including between FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel and Assistant Secretary Davidson. We are stronger when we work together. NTIA plays a critical role in advising the executive branch, managing spectrum for federal use, and bringing experts together to collaborate. On our end at the FCC, we, of course, administer spectrum for non-federal use and regulate the users that rely on it. And in so doing, we play a critical role in supporting wireless innovation that benefits consumers. And the Department of State, of course, leads efforts to ensure that U.S. needs are advanced on the global stage and that our technical expertise and innovation lead the way. It takes all of us working together to craft our nation's vision and to execute it. And of course, NTIA is now hard at work in drafting the implementation plan for the National Spectrum Strategy. The National Spectrum Strategy is a document with a vision. It lays out core principles that will propel our nation's spectrum management and use and identifies 5 bands for study for potential repurposing. Studying bands is a good first step, but it is only the beginning. To achieve the goals of this strategy, this process needs to move with alacrity. And I need to stress the importance of NTIA leading the studies identified in the National Spectrum Strategy. By virtue of its role as a manager of federal spectrum, as well as the fact that it is not a primary spectrum user, NTIA does not have a parochial interest in any specific band and is well positioned to be a trusted broker and manager of federal spectrum interests. In addition, we must recognize that there are some parts of the analysis that cannot be shared publicly. The importance of having an independent, trusted voice leading these studies, therefore, cannot be overstated. But NTIA cannot do this alone. It needs the strong backing from the White House and the Secretary of Commerce as it moves this important initiative forward. Looking ahead, the Commission will remain engaged in the National Spectrum Strategy implementation over the coming months and years. In this regard, Chairman Rosenworcel joined the first meeting of the Interagency Spectrum Advisory Council, which the President established to serve as the principal interagency forum for heads of agencies to advise NTIA on spectrum policy matters, and to ensure that all decisions made by NTIA take into consideration the diverse missions of the federal government. Although the FCC is an independent agency, we look forward to bringing our expertise to this important conversation. And I very much look forward to collaborating with our federal partners on the implementation of this important strategy. Of course, reinstating the Commission's auction authority is critical to the FCC's ability to move forward. Second, we need to continue to work together to manage this resource effectively and efficiently. This includes both looking at our processes to collaborate on spectrum management and to consider all models of spectrum management, including spectrum sharing. I believe the implementation plan will help us improve our day-to-day cooperative process by coordinating agency actions. As we have less and less new spectrum to identify, we are going to need to continue to coordinate even more closely to identify the best path forward for managing this resource. There is limited greenfield spectrum left. As consumer demand for wireless devices grows and new wireless uses are developed, identifying spectrum for exclusive use licenses will become more and more difficult. This is where American ingenuity and innovation can again set an example for the world. We can try to identify new spectrum, but we need to acknowledge that sharing needs to be part of our toolbox going forward. Dynamic spectrum sharing approaches will be key, and developing and implementing techniques for dynamic spectrum sharing will create a new era for spectrum management and use. And this is where collaboration will be key. Spectrum sharing also requires a clearly established obligation to share by all stakeholders. That is, we cannot expect private sector innovators to invest billions of dollars in spectrum subject to sharing unless it can be delivered with clear, reliable obligations by all parties to the sharing arrangements. The good news is that we have experience with innovative sharing arrangements that both protect incumbents and permit new users to enter a specific band. We have a lot to learn still, but we are well on our way. Third, our international efforts are critical to ensure continued leadership in all things spectrum. From leading our nation's preparations from WRC 23, prior to my current gig, I learned that the thirst for wireless innovation is global. In conversations with regulators and delegates from other nations, it was clear we must continue to foster wireless innovation and support our spectrum goals by building relationships with them. Our unified presence in global stages like the WRC is critical. I think the entire U.S. delegation, under Deputy Assistant Secretary Steve Lang, and with the participation of the FCC and NTIA, accomplished great advancements advocating for U.S. positions at WRC 23. Continuing to build relationships with regulators around the world is critical to advance our positions and to support our leadership. And of course, we need continued collaboration with industry and those that take spectrum policy and turn it into real technology. The National Spectrum Strategy is a critical blueprint for continuing to create more access to spectrum, advance innovation in spectrum management and use, and maintain our global leadership in wireless innovation. Congratulations to the NTIA, to the White House on releasing the strategy. The upcoming implementation plan will get us all right to work. We have much work ahead of us, and I look forward to the opportunity to bring my expertise in domestic and international spectrum policy to our collective efforts and our shared success. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, both for joining us today and for the work you're doing at the Commission. So all of us in government know the press can be tough, right? So I need to tell you, I got a text after I made my initial remarks from a reporter saying, "I've heard that joke before." It's true, we asshole the jerk. I told you there was only one, right? So I have, and by the way, I really do know there's, I got on ChatGPT to see if I could come up with another joke. So it turns out there are some real failings in AI. It's not funny either, right? The jokes I got from ChatGPT on Spectrum actually didn't make sense. So I have a task for the rest of you, because you'll have breaks during the day. Come up with another joke by the end of the conference. And I want to give whoever comes up with it credit from the podium. So that's your, okay? So with jokes out of the way and reporters' snarky questions out of the way, he's heard the joke before. Let me call up our first panel. We're going to take like a 5-minute break while our panelists come up, and then I will introduce them to you. But no more than 5-minute breaks, and you can use that time to look for a joke if you like. Can I call our panelists up? I get a hug. You bet. Where you want? I don't know. It's cool. The reception is great. Hey, Jennifer. How are you?
Can we sit anywhere we want?
See the man with the name tag. She said the middle. Yeah. Oh, great. It is indeed. I have to introduce you and then.
Okay. Just get my stuff organized here. Should I just wait behind you here?
Yeah, sure. Okay, your 5 minutes are up. It actually hasn't been 5 minutes, but your 5 minutes are up anyway, because, you know, Spectrum is crowded. Somebody appreciates me. So we have two important panel discussions to round out this morning's session. As Alan noted earlier, our panel discussions today mirror the 4 pillars of the Spectrum strategy. So, understandably, because we can count, we begin with Pillar 1, which spells, I love it when people giggle at me, at least. Pillar 1 clearly spells out the need to maintain a pipeline of spectrum for federal and for non-federal uses, and identifies some 2,700 megahertz of spectrum to study over the next 2 years. From many people's perspective, this was sort of the marquee element of the strategy. And as you know, putting together a list of spectrum bands for repurposing is not easy, nor is it likely to make you many friends. Right, yes, that's a laughable line too, because just saying, because you don't make any friends. Determining how to proceed with the studies and on what timelines and what kind of governance and technical parameters to use remains a complex and a difficult task. We are committed to this process, which is led by this panel's moderator and one of the best people I have ever met, Charles Cooper, the Associate Administrator of the NTIA Office of Spectrum Management. He is smart, he is hardworking, and Spectrum Management couldn't be in better hands. Charles, if you would come to the podium.
Thank you. Boy, what a setup that is. All right. So welcome everyone. I know it's has been a challenge for some of us to get here this morning. It seems like the traffic coming on the 14th Street Bridge and the 50. I almost thought for a second coming in on the 14th Street Bridge, and there was a pretty significant backup. It says, wow, all these people are coming to the symposium. But then I realized, you know, we're just kind of a relatively small group of friends here. So as it was set up, we've got a great panel one here, the first panel to lead off, dealing with the focus from the lead element of the Spectrum strategy. And I like to kind of quote from it here to kind of set the stage, if you would allow me. And from the strategy, it says, to continue our nation's economic growth, To maintain and improve our global competitive and to support critical public services and missions, we must make spectrum available for innovative new uses and to meet the growing demand. The strategy considers what's called a spectrum pipeline to encompass spectrum bands that are in various stages of consideration for repurposing, allowing new or additional uses through relocation and sharing, and to satisfy both federal and non-federal needs. Let me quickly introduce the panelists, then we'll quickly as well segue into the questions. I'd like to also to open it up during the panel discussion for audience questions as well as we think about this forward-looking strategy. So if you would like to think about questions, you may ask our esteemed panelist. But if I can go through the introductions rather quickly, I think we know everyone here, but let's go through the line here. We have Dr. Robert Hampshire from the Department of Transportation, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology. Jonathan Campbell, FCC Chairwoman's Legal Advisor on Wireless, International, and Space Issues. Jennifer Warren, Vice President, Regulatory Affairs and Public Policy at Lockheed Martin. Umair Jawad, CTI Senior Vice President for Spectrum. Well, that's quite a title. And James Ashley, Executive Vice President, Internet and Television Association, the NCTA. So let's kind of jump right into the questions, if we will. We've had some great keynote speakers, talking about the importance of spectrum, not only the pipeline, but workforce development, spectrum sharing. So, from a strategy perspective, I can bring this question to you, Robert, to start off with. It's a very kind of a long strategy. Some of the administration's documents are a little bit shorter, but this one is a little bit longer because there are a lot of, spectrum is not an easy subject. But, if you look at, the spectrum came out just before the WRC, so now we've had a few months to kind of think about it as well and get some feedback. So how do you think overall we did with the strategy, Robert?
Thanks, Charles. That's a great opening question. First, it's just really terrific to be here. And, I think NTIA had a gargantuan task to put together the National Spectrum Strategy, but of course, with colleagues from the White House, the leadership of Alan Davidson, you all did a really terrific job pulling together all the different stakeholder perspectives, inside of government, outside of government, but from the agency perspective. So at the Department of Transportation, I lead the Office of Research and Technology, which really across all the modes. So that's helping coordinate, working with colleagues in aviation, maritime, rail, transit, on the road, really working with those colleagues on the mission. And that's something for agencies in the spectrum strategy that, we always come to the table with our missions, and particularly around safety at the Department of Transportation. And, that mission, together with innovation, together with leaning forward into the new applications that are emerging in the transportation sector. So we're really balancing that safety mission, but with innovation leaning forward, which we're really doing. I can say a little bit more about that later, but for you all to pull together different agencies that have their missions together with this vision for the future, for particularly Pillar 1 on the spectrum pipeline, was a huge task. It wasn't always easy, I'm sure, for you all, but we were just really happy that and really satisfied to be at the table, that our voice was genuinely heard, taken into account, and we move forward in a very constructive way. So I just give you all kudos for the process and how you all went about putting this strategy together.
Are there other panelists that wish to respond to that?
Well, I'm happy to add kudos. It is a gargantuan task, and I'm always reminded whenever anyone addresses the issue of spectrum, because there's so many industries and so many different people that have an interest in that when you're talking about the work ahead, and this is really kind of setting the table for the hard work to be done, it is important to kind of orient ourselves around what is important and what are the objectives that we're all trying to accomplish. And I think, kudos to the entire team at NTIA and all throughout the government that worked on this. But it really does, I think, do a very good job setting the table for the balance that we have to strike in protecting our security interests, but promoting commercial use and recognizing the increasing demand from the commercial sector for spectrum use. And as a representative of the cable industry, spectrum is not really about one particular service or another. It's about connectivity, and I think Alan said that earlier today, because no matter what type of network or what type of operations you're going to run, you're going to want to be able to get data from a server somewhere to the device in somebody's hands. And increasingly, there are more and more devices, if your home is anything like mine, so those demands just continue to increase. So I think it does a great job of setting the table with those issues. I think it's, if I have to characterize its tone, I'll steal a word from Secretary Raimondo. It is ambitious, but it should be so in trying to identify bands that we want to study. But paired with that ambition, I think, is optimism that we have new tools in the toolbox with which to be able to meet commercial demand, whether that's through licensed, shared spectrum, unlicensed spectrum. All of those are going to be the lifeblood of the techniques and the strategies that we're going to use in order to kind of meet that commercial demand. And lastly, I would just say that the hard work is still ahead, and that we do really have to go band by band to determine what are the incumbencies, what are the potential for coexistence that we have, and how we can best manage the spectrum for the benefit of the American people.
Jennifer?
Since we're all jumping in, I'll add to the kudos. I think, it reads well, and I really like the way Alan framed it in his opening comments, because he paired what the consumer experience is looking for with what the military is looking for, with other federal users are looking for. They're very common experiences, common drivers. And I think the thing that we really like about the way the NSS reads is I like the term optimism, but it tees up the opportunity to kind of renew and expand U.S. global leadership in technology writ large, technology that serves the national security, that serves other federal needs, that serves wireless, consumer subscription, non-subscription needs. It's really optimistic in that way, and is very balanced, and hopefully sets the stage for what we like to kind of be optimistic about 21st century spectrum governance. We've been doing a lot of things the same way for a long time, which has served us well. But now let's pivot and have new leadership in a new direction that keeps us ahead of everyone, whether it's commercial competitors or near-peer threats.
Yeah, I would just add, first of all, the appreciation that we have in the collaboration with working with all of our federal partners, and particularly NTIA. The development of the National Spectrum Strategy was a bit of a journey, and so often when we think about how a journey went, I would say we give this 5 stars and a nicely worded comment, just like you would in a ride share, but...
And a tip.
And a tip, well, always a tip, oh, come on. I think we cannot view spectrum policy as a zero-sum game. Spectrum policy and spectrum-based technology evolutions that have driven economic growth and consumer benefits, all of that can also drive imperative federal missions. And I think that this study recognizes that, and just echoing some of the things we've already heard from our opening speakers and the folks up here on the stage. And so this is establishing a pipeline that is going to try to tackle that whole, kind of the whole playing field in front of us. I think with the first pillar, it's ambitious, and it recognizes that time is not on our side, and we need to move swiftly to come to a conclusion on this. But again, I just want to echo some of the things that we heard from the opening speakers, particularly Commissioner Gomez. The key to success here is that all stakeholders come to it with collaboration and cooperation in mind, and the strategy weaves that throughout. I think it's something that is built upon, excuse me, the long-standing relationship that the FCC has had with NTIA and all of our federal partners. It's ingrained in some of the past successes that we've had in spectrum policy. It is a foundation of the MOU that we have established with NTIA that has led to some of those successes. And as we focus some of our efforts on implementing the national spectrum strategy, we're also mindful that we're going to keep moving forward on spectrum policy and working in close collaboration in areas in addition to the national spectrum strategy. There's an example of this just last week when, after some very close collaboration with our friends at DoD and NTIA, we were able to adopt an order that is going to bring more efficient use to the 70, 80, and 90 gigahertz bands and bring some new use cases to that. That's just another example of where we think that there's opportunities to keep finding ways to innovate and moving forward on spectrum policy in tandem and complementary to the national spectrum strategy.
So everyone put that so nicely, and I'm going to add my plus one on the strategy. I was lucky enough to work on it from inside the government. I was lucky enough to work on it from outside of the government, and I think Dr. Hampshire has it right. I think Scott Harris is the only person who could have pulled this document together and still be making jokes at the end of it. So he was the right man for the job. What a critical time for a document like this. We're starting 2024 off still without auction authority for the FCC. We're starting 2024 off further behind on mid-band spectrum compared to our peers and our rivals than we were in 2023. Deputy Neuberger did such a good job this morning explaining why that's important, why that deserves our attention. And so this is just the right moment for a document like this to be pulled together. Strategy is really important. And there are a lot of cautionary tales out there as to why that is. And one that jumps to mind for me is Kodak. It's a company we all know. For a very long time, it was synonymous with photography. Their photo printing processes were global, and they were technologies ahead of their competition. They were the first to the digital camera, and they even developed a strategy of how they were going to stay ahead of future trends in the market. But that strategy didn't put resources behind their new digital technology because they had decided it was not going to be disruptive enough. And we all know how the story ends. They had 10 years to do something, and they never did. They lost 75% of the value of their company before they went bankrupt. It shows that the stakes are very high, how fast this can happen. We too are now at the cusp of new technologies. We too are making predictions about whether these technologies are going to be disruptive or not. We too are deciding whether we're going to put resources behind these technologies, whether we're going to allocate from the old to the new when we do so. And it's important that we get these questions right. The strategy gives us a framework to start to answer those questions. It does a very good job of directing people what they should be working on over the next couple of years. I think if there's anything we need to add to it now, the one concern I do have is that I worry if we are overemphasizing the metrics around process, and meanwhile, we might just miss the boat on progress in doing so. I think we need to add in the benchmarks, the goals. We need to define the vision of where we want to be 2 years from now so that it can guide that decision-making between now and then. And I think the NTIA's implementation plan is the perfect place to start strengthening that area of it as well.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm glad I'm not going to be rushed off the stage. I think that's a natural lead to the next question, which I'm considering here. So, Ann Neuberger as well spoke about, what she envisioned from the strategy and what her two big points were. One was the spectrum pipeline. So there are several bands that were identified in the strategy for study, right? We're talking about the lower 3 gigahertz band, the 5030 to 5091, 7 gigahertz band, and the 18 gigahertz band, along with the 37 gigahertz band. So, Jonathan, if I may turn this question over to you. So what do you think, in light of these bands identified for study in this Pillar 1, what do you think the new and improved services and technologies may result from these?
So I think that the bands included in the study, I think it's representative of our country's growing need and demand for spectrum, both on the federal side and on the commercial side. On the commercial side, where the FCC is mindful of how we can best foster competition and innovation. We see that there's opportunities here for licensed and unlicensed, for satellite and terrestrial, for broadband services and transportation applications, just to name a few, and that's not even to mention the various different federal applications in the bands. And so the FCC is going to be actively engaged in this and how we can develop opportunities and how we can, through this study process, put ourselves on a glide path to establishing flexible use rules to really cement new services in these bands and also to foster innovation. So just to touch on some of that you mentioned, there's of course lower 3 gigahertz and there's 7 and 8 gigahertz. These have been identified by commercial industry as particularly promising for advanced wireless services, and I'm sure you'll hear about that from some of my fellow panelists up here. But there's also unique opportunities for these bands for global harmonization, which, as we've heard from many other folks here today, is particularly key for advancing American leadership in wireless, and also with that comes our national security interests. So, but I think we need to, with this, and recognizing that there's a lot of federal use and incumbency in this band, we need to come into it with an open mind and to really examine a wide variety of solutions to reach our end goal here of fostering both commercial innovation as well as critical federal missions. 5 gigahertz, it's a band that's important for the growth of UAS and drones, and we've been having a good collaboration with the FAA and the Department of Transportation and NTIA in our proceeding on this. And I think that the strategy mentions that there's a good two-prong approach that we can take to this, which is swift action to really inject innovation and to have early movement within this band that the FCC can take within our proceeding, and again, in collaboration with the FAA and NTIA, while the strategy can look to the evolution of the broader framework and take on some of the bigger challenges and the future challenges that will come with 5 gigahertz. So really a positive two-prong approach there. And then in lower 37, this is another one in which the FCC has a proceeding on, and which is an opportunity. It's earmarked for shared non-federal and federal use. But I wanted to pivot again where there can be synergies between some of the ongoing work at the FCC that can feed into and bolster the national spectrum strategy. And we recently had a rulemaking on 42 gigahertz, and it's another millimeter wave band and very similar in many aspects to 37 gigahertz, in which we ask commenters to think creatively, to think about a licensing regime kind of different from our regular geographic license auction that can really come up with an effective method for efficient use of the band. And we got some fantastic feedback. And some of the feedback that we got was, what would work in this band could also work in lower 37. And so as we continue our work on 42 gigahertz, we're going to be mindful of how that can help the process in the national spectrum strategy and where that can get us to our goals even quicker. And then 18 gigahertz, that's satellite spectrum we've had a lot of experience with over our time, and I think that's just indicative of how the space economy, how quickly it's growing, how many new applications that are already coming to market right now, but things that we haven't even begun to think of. We recently circulated for consideration by the commission an item on new rules for in-space servicing and manufacturing, and it kind of boggles the mind, the variety of different applications that come with that. Applications that can develop new pharmaceuticals, can extend the life of satellites, and applications that can actually be proactive in the removal of orbital debris. And so the strategy has listed a set of bands that has really covered the gamut of wireless use, both for federal and non-federal. But I think, as I mentioned before, it's and just to echo what the chairwoman has said frequently, you always have to partner long-term planning with short-term action. And so we're going to continue to move forward on some of our spectrum policies that we think are going to have a really impactful, immediate effect for businesses, consumers, and I think some of our federal partners. One that immediately jumps to mind is our supplemental coverage from space proceeding. which we continue to work on. And then lastly, I thank Umair for noting this. I think as we think about all of this, all of the spectrum strategy, we also need to be mindful that we can set ourselves on a glide path to putting the spectrum that comes out of this strategy into commercial use and into federal use as quickly as possible. From the FCC's perspective, I think that we are very mindful that we do not have our auction authority, and that's somewhat limiting in our ability to do spectrum planning and to do the prep work that is going to be necessary once we reach an end result of these initial studies. And so we're optimistic that that'll be restored, but I think it is a crucial element to this.
Thank you.
I think, Jonathan said it very well. There's so much exciting stuff that's happening in the spectrum world. I personally, I love talking to Jennifer. We've talked about what Lockheed Martin is doing to improve safety for first responders.
This is going to blow everybody.
That's right. But it's an issue close to my heart, and I love that there's attention there and that there's progress there, and there's so much exciting things that's happening. I think in addition to the question of what technology is coming, equally important is the question of who is benefiting from these new technologies. And one thing that I think we've learned over the past year is just how critical mid-band spectrum is to not only bringing about new technology, but also making it available, making sure that every American can benefit from those technologies by spreading their reach. I'll talk about the mobile industry for a little bit. With the 2.5, the 3.45, and the 3.7 gigahertz bands now deployed, next generation networks are reaching 97% of the population. That means they're benefiting from that new technology. And with these mid-bands now deployed, what we saw over the last year was 5G speeds jumped more than 40% in a single year. And that's exciting, and it's led to exciting developments. In our industry, one of those examples is new 5G home offerings. It's bringing new competition to the broadband marketplace, and it's helping to close the digital divide as well, with more than 20% of 5G gross adds are first-timers to the broadband marketplace. So I'm very excited to see what potentially comes with the addition of these new mid-band spectrum bands that are in the National Spectrum Strategy.
I think the only other thing I'd add to that is, going back to your question, what services are going to be created? I mean, we can, read the Wall Street Journal and see Apple's new lens, and, that's the one that's in front of us. But I think we all know there's enough history in broadband to know that the real innovations come from somewhere out there, from the people that we're able to bring into the system, the innovators, the creators. And that comes through a policy that is designed to promote competition, to promote access to the key inputs that will create these types of innovations. I think the other thing to remember as we move forward, we start with this document, but to Jonathan's point, we're not completely starting against a blank page. There are proceedings that have been longstanding at the commission. You mentioned 37 gigahertz, where we are down the field. There are areas of our experience with spectrum in 6 gigahertz, where we have learned critical things about coexistence that may be able to be extended to 7 gigahertz and to create an additional Wi-Fi gigabit Wi-Fi channel. So there are lessons that we have from our history and experience that hopefully we can port into the work ahead of us. There's an entire paths process where we learned a lot about sharing capabilities and potential. We have more work to do, but I think all of us are anxious to move forward so that we can, to Mayor's point, get some actionable progress in making spectrum commercially available.
Yeah, certainly very exciting opportunities. Robert, I think you had something as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such an exciting time for transportation and infrastructure. With Secretary P, we're implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, but in that speaks to just how exciting things are in transportation these days. For example, we could start on the surface. Certainly, we've looked at vehicle to infrastructure, V2X. Certainly that we've been working together with colleagues at FCC to get that band utilized. In fact, with stakeholders in private sector and states and others, putting together a national interoperable deployment plan for V2X. And so that interoperable means 5.9, which is not a band we're under study here, but 5.9 plus other parts of the spectrum to really get to that interoperable connectivity. So we have a nationwide deployment plan on that. And so that certainly lays the groundwork for what we see as the next year for automation and other sorts of situational awareness and connectivity needs as we look to the future of automation on the surface side. When you think about high data rates that are going to be needed to send, LiDAR data back and forth and other so forth, there's certainly needs there. As we go from surface to air, we also know that advanced air mobility, something you might have thought about a long time ago, like Jetsons, flying taxis, that they're here now. And part of what is happening certainly is the integration of those services into the airspace, surveillance of those, communications, navigation. There's certainly going to be enhanced needs, certainly with the bands that are there in the 5 gigahertz range, but others that really think about how to fully integrate advanced air mobility into the things we do. And I'll also say that, the Department of Transportation, you all may know, is we have the largest number of allocations outside of the Department of Defense. If you look at FAA, as far as agency, for civilian agencies, we have a lot of equities in spectrum, and one of those is GPS and PNT. And so certainly we're building out complementary PNT services. And some of those services use various parts of the spectrum. Some of those alternative or complementary PNT systems are terrestrial based, some may be space based, and others that, when you think about timing as well, will leverage what is the increasing needs for spectrum in those areas around complementary PNT. So I think it's just really, again, exciting time. A lot of innovation happening in transportation innovation that could take advantage of some of these additional spectrum that's available in bands as we look to the future.
Yeah, and I'm so glad, Robert, that you brought out the other use cases beyond just communications, such as GPS, which is actually called out in the first part of the spectrum strategy on the importance of maintaining that allocation. Also, with regard to the UAS, the 5030 to 5091, developing the service rules for that. If we look at the public comments that we received here at NTIA on the implementation, there was a surprising number dealing with that and encouraging development of those rules because there's such an enthusiasm for what the UAS environment could bring us in this country. Jennifer, I think you wanted to say something as well?
So I'm going to just add my comment to the development of the autonomy economy, which is like how we like to characterize it. There's a whole economy that can be unleashed through working through autonomy in the various sectors, and this strategy will help kick that off. But I really appreciated Jonathan's reference to federal innovation as well, because when we look at what we're doing, what the larger aerospace and defense industry is doing, next generation radar capabilities in this band, in the lower mid-band in particular, are significant. So when we talk about innovation, and that's why I think the National Spectrum Strategy is important, it recognizes that innovation that's important to technology leadership for the United States is not just from communications, consumer communications. It's a much broader ecosystem. And so minimizing disruption to technology innovation for national security, where we are already an established leader and want to maintain, is equally important to reestablishing wireless leadership. It should not be disrupted to the expense of the other. So minimization is important. I think we can see the importance that the lower mid-band has for warfighter capabilities, just to be blunt, by the fact that at the World Radio Conference, the lower mid-band was rejected for a future IMT study, which is 5G, 6G. And so there is that recognition as a very important national security band. So I echo Umair's and Jonathan's emphasis on harmonization. It is harmonized, and clearly that conference spoke to the need to maintain it harmonized for these purposes. And I'm sure we'll have more conversation about the WRC later. But I wanted to just emphasize those 2 points, and as I said, we'll come back to some others. Thank you.
So we've been talking about some of the services that we can roll into it, and not to pick on Amir here, but you mentioned, well, we'd like to see some action here. but we still have a process, right? And I recall what Commissioner Gomez spoke in her number one point is we have to have that collaboration, right? So Jennifer, I think, maybe you could kind of lead us off in discussion on what do you think kind of the governance structure should look like, to make sure we're hearing all the voices we need and, to make sure that we're fulfilling that collaboration framework.
Yeah, because I think collaboration really is at the heart of it. I don't think anyone's going to disagree up here on that. And process matters. I agree metrics matter, but they can't be metrics that are this is the outcome, so it's foreordained, and this is just process to check a box. It has to be meaningful process where we want to get to what the science-based, data-driven answers are. So if we look at the PATHS process that was under the National Spectrum Consortium and created by DoD, and that was kind of revolutionary in the sense it had people at the table that never had that kind of forum to be at the table before. And there are obviously improvements that can be made with lessons learned and co-leadership roles and ways to grant CUI access more quickly. But the room was full of people that had never had CUI access to data before. And then the classified section there were a lot of additional classified clearances, security clearances given to really expand that discussion. So kudos to that process. And what that tells me a little bit is, with a few improvements, and I'll talk about them in a minute, having a process where you can have NTIA and the at least primary impacted federal agency, the spectrum management teams, co-lead the process is very important, because the process is not just about technical feasibility. It has to be about what is the operational feasibility, and what is the connective tissue between the particular systems that are in that band with a larger operational environment, which isn't necessarily the way the comms networks work, right? Joint all-domain operations, for those of you who follow DoD and the national security strategy as opposed to the spectrum strategy, will be familiar with that. But you've got to take it in the whole concept of operations, or ConOps. And so the spectrum managers can co-lead, but then you've got to have those that actually understand how the systems operate, which is why you've got to have that agency that's most impacted at the table co-leading. I respect different opinions on this, but if timeliness is important, which is what I keep hearing, then you want not a sequential process, you want a process that has everyone in roles and responsibilities from the very beginning. So that'd be the first thing I say. The second thing I'd say is that you need all of the affected industries at the table, which I do think the PATHS process got right. Cable was there, MNOs were there, radar manufacturers were there. I'm not sure if any industry that felt it had equity in that particular band being studied in the PATHS process wasn't there. I didn't hear if they weren't, but I know the rooms I sat in, they were full and very varied. The process was very transparent in many ways, even to the final report, going through a line-by-line, page-by-page edit process, where everyone who sat in that CUI room was able to offer edits. Now, they may have been rejected, but that's not a process issue. You can quibble on the substance and the outcome, but the process disposed of every edit offered. Again, I think that's good from a transparency perspective. I think also having academia at the table is important in terms of inclusiveness. They're doing R&D in different ways that can be brought to the table. Also, having those who do simulation and modeling at the table can be very beneficial. Whether it's, obviously I'm a stakeholder, so maybe you wouldn't want, a stakeholder doing it, but a third-party stakeholder to do sim and modeling could be very useful. The other thing I'd say is, depending upon the bands, not all bands will require a classified access, but if they do, again, that repetition of how they did it in the PATHS process would be good. One improvement area, I would say, is there needs to be a clear, transparent timeline, or a clear timeline for transparency in the results. So we've all seen that it's been a little jumbled. messy, this process of getting at least the executive summary released and, what the final was, even though we all were there before it went out of DoD. We want to make sure that the public that participated has access to that data and the results. And so I think, those are very important elements. I also think it's very important to understand, are we looking at 5G as the family of 5G? Or are we only looking at one flavor of 5G when we go into a study? So I think that has to be very clear up front, because we all want industries to be part of the process immediately at the front end. But is it just high power, wide area networks? Is it low power CBRS-like? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it SATCOM? Is it proliferated LEOs? I don't know, but I think those kinds of parameters need to be defined up front as well. Because 5G is not just wide area networks, high power wide area networks. It's a family of capabilities. So those would be my thoughts, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mark.
So,
Yeah.
let me start at the top. Completely agree with what Commissioner Gomez said this morning, with what Jennifer just said, with what Jonathan said, that collaboration is important. And when I was at the FCC, one of the first things I worked on was setting up the Spectrum Coordination Initiative in order to help enable that kind of collaboration. I believe then, and I believe now, that I think we have to cultivate and not repress almost a healthy dissatisfaction with the status quo. In the sense that too often it took the very blunt instrument of crisis to get people to the table to actually start talking and sharing information and putting the things on the table that we needed to make good policy. And we had to get past that. And so the spectrum coordination was an effort to do that. Certainly the strategy is as well. So collaboration is important. I think as we think about collaboration in the context of the strategy and where we go from here, the first thought that I would have is that we need to put NTIA back in charge of spectrum studies. I think they have a lot of expertise. They are a trusted agent on this. It's what the presidential memorandum requires. I think that when you give incumbents with a vested interest in the band control over the study, it creates perverse interests, no matter who that incumbent is. And what that means is that at the end of the study process, no matter what, it just puts in a question mark over the study. You end up with stakeholders who are more entrenched, not closer together. And we see that in the PATS process, where 2 years later, as Jennifer noted, we still don't have a report. We don't have people closer together. And you do have people that are more entrenched. I think that there was a lot of good about the PATS process. It represented a very good step in the sense of the federal government working with industry and sharing information. And we can build on that. We can continue that. On co-leading, I have a lot of questions about what that means, and I hope the implementation plan can put some detail around it. What does it mean for NTIA and DoD to co-lead a study? Where do the responsibilities divide, and how does that work? I think there's a lot of questions about that. I do think that if co-leading is the goal, what we saw in PATS was there were places where stakeholders didn't get to share in setting the direction of the work. And that's where a lot of the process, that's where a lot of people point to flaws in that process. For example, defining the scope of the studies to begin with. That was a unilateral decision to say we're only going to look at a very subset of what we think is a definition of sharing. We're not going to look at tried and true methods that have worked to share spectrum in the past. And so if we're going to talk about co-leading, then I think it's got to be everyone sharing in setting the direction of the work as well. I think that when we talk about what are we trying to get at with these studies, is it 5G, is it the family of 5G, is it something else? I think we have to also look at where are we as a country. And what we've seen in the past couple of years is a lot of progress in making available spectrum for unlicensed and shared use. In fact, we're leading the world on that metric. We've made 1,350 megahertz available over the past couple of years for unlicensed and shared use, much of that contiguous mid-band spectrum. Meanwhile, we continue to trail the world on mid-band spectrum for full power wide area use, which, as Deputy Newberger said this morning, is a critical metric in our competition with China. And so I do think that as we start to scope out these projects, we should make sure that the products of them are actually fulfilling the needs of the country.
James.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and make two comments. One, I agree that the PATS process, we can always learn from any process we go through. But that connective tissue, to be able to work with federal partners and commercial entities, to have everyone working to solve a problem, and to recognize that we're probably not going to have a eureka moment where it's all, oh, well, this just works. These are going to be iterative steps, and we're going to have to build confidence, and we're going to have to do the heavy lifting necessary. It's difficult, obviously, when you're talking about sensitive systems and you're talking about people who haven't had a whole lot of experience with that. Hopefully, a number of the entities that are participating in the PATH process, their knowledge of the process and the agencies and the equities involved only increase. But that is the collaboration that we're going to need to solve hard problems. And as far as the result, I go back to what the goal is, to really get more commercial spectrum available. I hope we can get away from these megahertz to megahertz comparisons. I don't think they're very apt. I think you can juke the numbers a lot of ways to make them look funny, and you can ignore the fact that unlicensed spectrum is available to everybody, even mayor's members, not just like mobile carriers. So the real issue is we have hard problems. We need to have process by which we can solve them, and I hope that PAS at least sets the table for a process that we're going to face in solving the problems that we have in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Robert?
Yeah, I want to say a little bit here on the collaboration of the process. We've brought this up before, but you know, the split between federal and non-federal spectrum, sometimes it's not always that clear. On paper it is, but oftentimes, like in transportation, we have regulated entities and industries, right? That having those folks that we work with on a regulation basis at the table as well is very valuable. And how do we continue to think about that and then the process? And I think when we think about collaboration and how do we bring the private sector in, I think, you know, finding creative ways to make sure we're hearing the voices of particularly, or in our case, like regulated entities and in the mix. And I think we've learned some things in the past and how to do that going forward. So I just want to.
Yep. Most of the table of allocations is shared spectrum between federal and non-federal.
That's right.
Yeah. Jonathan, did you?
Yeah, thank you. That's so true when you look at the table of allocations. And, you know, I think that this process is only going to stand to benefit from an array of voices, a diversity of voices that are bringing really important perspectives to this. And I think that it's going to be vital that as we go into these studies and we implement these studies, that we go into it with a mentality of we leave no stone unturned. And so there's some discussion and clearly about where the goals should lie. But I think that it's important that we take every opportunity to explore every option here as we find ways to find spectrum efficiency and meet a broad variety of goals here. And so, again, to the theme of collaboration, I think that coming into that process from the commercial stakeholders, from the federal stakeholders, from the FCC's perspective, I think that's going to be very, very important. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So let's take a moment to reach out to the audience here to see if there are any questions for the panelists. I think we have some microphones that may be available here, so if you would like to ask a question, just simply raise your hand. I would ask if you identify your name and any affiliation. That would be helpful here.
We can't see you, so.
Yeah, I've got to glare at the lights here, so if there are any hands being raised.
There are people in the room?
And I'm not seeing any hands. No questions? No? Oh, we have one here on my right.
Hi, thank you. My name's Karen Clothier. I work for a company called Teltrium, and we support NASA, amongst others. So I wanted to follow on from a comment that I believe Umar made about resources, and I'm curious if there's been much thought put into how the work that goes into conducting these studies will be resourced and supported. Thanks.
Just if I get a little bit more granularity on your question, you're talking resources in terms of the agencies and other entities performing the studies?
Yeah, resources broadly construed. Where are the people going to come from? How is their time going to be allocated? How are they going to be paid? And then, I guess broadly speaking, how do you envision ensuring that they have the capabilities, the tools, the equipment to actually collect the data that will inform the studies?
Okay. Any,
I think that's a question.
yeah, I've kind of thought it was for me, but I was sort of hoping someone would volunteer.
I'd love to hear the answers.
So I think there are a couple answers. Number one, in terms of doing the studies and getting into the weeds here, but we have some statutory availability called the Spectrum Relocation Fund, the SRF as it's called. You know, for those studies that may be eligible for an auction, and those are a couple bands here, the federal agencies may be able to seek funding opportunities through that to help provide the resources to provide the study materials. We see that a lot of agencies being able to avail themselves of that. And of course, NTA is already in discussions with the agencies on how we may expedite that to the extent possible. The other aspect of the SRF is post-auction, if there is an auction, right, being able to support any transaction, any transition activities that may be required, such as if systems have to be relocated or modified in some way. So there'll be opportunity for agencies to seek reimbursement that way. So that's principally through the SRF. So I think that's probably what you were looking for there. Again, I think, Jennifer, I kind of,
I would say that was a great question, and we're in conversations with Charles about this.
Oh, yes.
But I also just wanted to jump in that a key component of that is auction authority. And so to be blunt, the money has to come from somewhere. And so, so I think that needs to be a priority as we start moving into the plan as well.
So the focus, I realized from Charles' answer, was on the federal side. The industry side of this, right? This is not inexpensive. We just went through the PATHS process, which was a very important process, and the things we're talking about as improvements would make it a more time-intensive process. And so that also draws a lot from industry. So those who want to participate, this is not for the faint-hearted. This is not for the drop-in. This is where you really have to make your engineers, your regulatory people available and committed and have that funding stream for them. Because, again, like I said before, it's great to have the technical engineering, but then you've got to have, is it convertible to a regulatory framework that is palatable with the way this government is currently structured to manage spectrum? And that is also a question of transition. So I just wanted to flag that because it costs a lot to do this.
It takes a lot of effort and time and investment. I agree. For the mobile industry, we're happy to do it. It's important. I do think it emphasizes also why it's important to get the details right up front. And again, PATS is a good example of this, where we spent 2 years with a study, and at the end of that study, I was encouraged to see the National Spectrum Strategy say, this didn't quite hit the mark, that there's more that needs to be done here. We need to go back and look at all the options on the table, not just the ones that were in that study. So that's great that the National Spectrum Strategy did that, but it also means we lost 2 years, and we need to make up for lost time.
Oh, sure. Go for it,
So
Jennifer.
the time was not lost. The outcome wasn't what one community wanted. So from that perspective, I guess it was lost time for that community.
Is that
But
the administration?
that would be the MNO. That would be CTIA. But I think when you look at, there's a community that is very optimistic, that includes wireless providers that are working together to support and try and move forward with implementation of what at least we knew was in the report. We still look forward to the release, to implementing it as phase 2 of that band, as opposed to a repeat of all the resources and time and effort that were done leading to the report. There's a path forward there. Let's spend time, again, everything is not defined by 5G high power wide area networks to meet consumer commercial access.
Oh, yep, please, go.
From the perspective of where do we go from here? We've always supported a balanced spectrum policy of having licensed, unlicensed, shared use. And again, what I come back to is where we see the most immediate near-term need is that ability to provide for full power, wide area coverage. And it's important. You know, we talk a lot about what do these shared and unlicensed bands potentially do in terms of adding to competition. But one thing that I think we have to realize is just making spectrum more accessible, but doing it in a way that dramatically increases the cost of wide area deployments doesn't necessarily get you competition. It doesn't necessarily get you investment. And we shouldn't be designing spectrum policies that minimize investment. We should be designing spectrum policies that ultimately maximize it. This isn't about one over all of the others. It's about balanced spectrum policy, and it's about catching up where we need to. The national spectrum strategy leaves very little room for error, because that lower 3 gigahertz band and that 7 and 8 gigahertz band are the few near-term opportunities to start to chip away at that gap that Deputy Newberger was talking about this morning. So there's not much of a safety margin in there. So when we do these studies, we've got to do it in a way that includes those full power, wide area coverage options, in addition to the shared options, in addition to the unlicensed options.
I'm going to try to thread the needle here.
Thank you.
So, and I think this goes back to the original question about resources and what I've heard from both Jennifer and Umair about dedication of industry's resources and dedication of government resources as we go into this. I think that certainly from the FCC's part, like, we are going to be actively involved in all of these studies. But I think at the end of the day, and this is where I'm going to try to thread the needle, what comes out of the studies here needs to be clear requirements and a clear path forward that can foster investment and innovation in these bands. And so there needs to be clarity and reliability within whatever comes out of this process. That's very much the mindset that the FCC is bringing into it. I'm sure it's being shared by our federal partners as we're thinking about it from both the commercial side, certainly, but also on the federal side. And so, and that's a challenge, and honestly, that's going to require a lot of work from all of us. We're looking forward to that work. We talked a little bit about a two-pronged approach, how we're going to keep moving the ball forward on spectrum policy. I'm sure the staff at the FCC is they're excited to jump into the national spectrum strategy, but we're committed, and it's going to be a lot of work, and the staff is ready to jump in.
Okay, Robert, and I'm being shown the clock here, so we have just 2 or 3 minutes, so if you could put the bow on it.
Yeah, I want the spirit of the question about resources. Although this is pillar 1, I want to say something about pillar 4, the people. And so short term, but longer term, I think Deputy Newberger said something. She said, spectrum is a national resource that connects and protects. I thought that was really, really important. But the resources, here when we think about the people, that we fund over 150 universities around the country in our University Transportation Centers program. I think we talk about pipeline. We need a new pipeline of people, spectrum experts, policymakers who are working in this space that are representative of our country, the broad swaths of different types of people. And that's going to be an important resource for us to have at the table and ultimately in the long term deliver for our nation. And so I just want to put the plug in here for people, and also from the people resource in the pipeline of students through universities into this profession.
I think that's a beautiful way of summing up, and especially also for a promo for this afternoon's panel on Pillar 4. I think Phil Murphy will be monitoring that. But yeah, we're out of time. We still had some more questions we wanted to get into, like the WRC and everything else, and we'll just have to find a way to talk about that at some future event. But I'd like to thank our panelists here today. Okay, Mr. Harris, or should we take a short break to convene for the next panel? What would you like to do, sir?
I will take your place at the podium.
All right.
Thank you all. Yes, you are dismissed. Thank you all. So I'm getting emails. Hi, Scott. Here's another Spectrum joke. And by the way, no disrespect to the person who sent this to me. It's proving my point. There is only one Spectrum joke. But nevertheless, one day my daughter said, "I finally have something in common with what you do at work." Really? What? "I hurt my leg playing ball and it like megahertz." Okay, that's a B+, right? Can I call our next panel up? Thank you all for participating in our first panel. And Charles, thank you for leading the discussion. Our second panelist should be here. Derek, you want to come to the stage? Yeah. You know, there's more work to be done, people. There he is. Okay, our second panel is going to be led by Derek Clopin, the Deputy Associate Administrator in the Office of Spectrum Management at NTIA. The strategy's second pillar charts a course towards more comprehensive coordination between the FCC and NTIA and both federal and private spectrum users. This is my favorite pillar. I don't know if you're allowed to have, you feel it's sort of like having a favorite child and maybe it's not allowed. But this is my favorite pillar of the National Spectrum Strategy because it seeks to establish a new coordination framework that will allow for better long-term planning, improved communication and collaboration, and reliance on evidence-based decision-making. The idea is that we're going to set up a process that brings together, really for the first time, the private sector and the public sector for long-term spectrum planning discussions, and so that not every discussion is a one-off, or every 5 years we turn around and say, oh my God, we need to do some spectrum planning, what do we do? This should be a continuing discussion, and that's what Pillar 2 of the National Spectrum Strategy is about. But while it provides a blueprint for perhaps better coordination, implementation is actually going to be a complex task with significant stakeholder involvement. This panel will explore many of the opportunities and challenges we face as we seek to bring government together with the private sector to achieve a more optimal spectrum management system. Derek?
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate the introduction, and I am really excited to have this panel here today. As I'll get into a moment, I think you'll agree with me that the diverse perspectives that we are going to hear is excellent. I won't repeat what this pillar is about. Scott did a nice framing job, so I'm gonna jump right into it here, and just note that I think it really is a nice complement to the first panel where we heard about these immediate efforts on these bands, and this is, I think, more of a mid to long-term approach here on how we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists, and then we'll jump right in, and I'll start immediately right here is John Kuzin, who's Vice President, Spectrum Policy and Regulatory Counsel at Qualcomm. Next to John is Flynn Rico Johnson. Flynn is Deputy Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Doris Matsui, and I know a lot of us know that his boss has been a longtime leader in Spectrum on the Hill, so we're very excited to have Flynn here. Next to Flynn is Brett Kilborn. Brett is of counsel at Stevens & Lee, and is here today, too, on behalf of the Utilities Technology Council, or UTC. Next to Brent is Mary Brown of Salt Point Strategies, and she is a spokesperson for Wi-Fi Forward. And then finally, but last but not least, Tom Wojtacek, who is the Director of Radio Frequency Management Division, Office of the Chief Information Officer at the National Oceanic and Ocean Administration, NOAA, in the Department of Commerce. So again, I appreciate the panelists joining us today, and I'm sure you'll agree with me. It's a nice collection of very experienced folks who can talk with us today. I'm going to jump in here with a bit of a opening or sort of framing question. And again, as I noted, we constructed this panel to hear from representatives who could speak to a broad range of spectrum uses and applications, and to the important, if silent, role that spectrum plays in the daily lives of Americans. We've certainly heard that already today. And again, as an opening question, what I would ask the panelists to do is to have each of you expand on that a little bit from your perspective in terms of the interest you are representing here today and the connection to why you think the time was right for the administration to have a national spectrum strategy. John, if you could start.
Certainly. So, Derek, thanks very much. I want to thank initially NTIA for organizing the event today and particularly for inviting Qualcomm to participate. I also want to thank the entire NTIA staff as well as the work of all the other agencies with spectrum interests that provided inputs that went into the strategy. It is a critically important moment for all of us who work on spectrum policy issues, and an even bigger moment to lay the foundation for continued economic growth, continued economic and national security in order to improve the lives of all Americans. Qualcomm is a world-leading wireless technology developer and chipset provider. We love all types of spectrum, and we love all types of spectrum uses, licensed, unlicensed, satellite, and the various and myriad federal users as well. We led the development of 5G technology as well as 4G and 3G before that, and we're also a world-leading Wi-Fi chipset supplier. Our innovations are in your pocket right now. They're used by millions of Americans every day, and our engineers work every day tirelessly in order to squeeze more spectral efficiency, more bits per second per hertz, while drawing less power. It is a never-ending engineering challenge. And we know that opening up spectrum for commercial purposes, which is a key goal of the National Spectrum Strategy, is critically important to continued economic growth. In essence, spectrum policy is economic policy, and it's also important for continued national security. If America's economy doesn't continue to grow, it will affect our nation's ability to continue to be a world leader on all fronts. In today's information economy, the opening of additional spectrum bands and enabling more intensive spectrum use is critically important. I also want to say a few words about the common enemy that we all face in the spectrum policy world: interference. Interference that prevents successful communications is harmful interference. Not all interference is harmful. Qualcomm has developed and is continuing to develop and refine wireless communications technologies that limit the amount of harmful interference they cause to others, as well as their susceptibility to harmful interference. But when harmful interference actually occurs, we all lose. At the same time, developing overprotective spectrum policies that make interference 100% impossible does not represent sound spectrum policy in today's world. By designing to prevent harmful interference in extreme corner cases, you lose the opportunity to take advantage of many opportunities to engage in successful communications. Today's radios are often multi-mode, and they have the capability to operate in multiple bands. If a particular channel is not available, the radio switch to an open channel, or they can use the same channel without causing interference. I also want to say a few words about the timing of the release of the NSS, given that it was in Derek's question. It's been roughly 13 and a half years since the release of the last major spectrum plan, the National Broadband Plan that came out in March of 2010. From our perspective, the timing of this effort is perfect. We need to get moving as soon as possible on each of the bands in the National Spectrum Strategy to support 5G Advanced and 6G. It is key to our continued success. The strategy is great, and we now need a plan to open the bands in the NSS as well as additional spectrum bands as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, John. Flynn?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank Scott and Derek and everyone at NTIA for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to have a chance to represent some of the Hill interests on this panel. As Derek said, my boss, Ranking Member Matsui, has always viewed spectrum policy as an integral part of her economic portfolio. In fact, to illustrate that point, her first letter to then President-elect Biden was asking him to develop a predictable, consistent dispute resolution process. I think the work of NTIA and everyone involved in the National Spectrum Strategy is the clearest answer to that letter we could have asked for. Not to disparage everyone on panel 1, but I think panel 2 is where the action is at. Like Scott, it's my favorite pillar, and I say that because I think about the old quote, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him to fish, you feed him for life. What we're doing here is making a sustainable down payment on spectrum governance in the United States. And at the risk of maybe stretching that analogy too far, it doesn't just mean fish more often and aggressively. Overfishing is bad for everyone. It means a sustainable way to make smarter decisions. And I think the output of this process will be decisions that reinforce a more durable national security, that mean a more dynamic economy, and that ensure that the United States remains the vanguard of innovation. So this type of work is, I think, kind of key. It's pervasive to everything we do. It's going to ensure that after all of these bands come and go, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, innovation is happening here in the United States. I'll repeat it, but innovation means durable national security. It means a dynamic economy, job growth, things that everyone involved in this process should care about and does care about. So Pillar 2 is where it's at. Happy to be here, and thanks NTIA for the invite.
Excellent, Flynn. Appreciate it. Brett?
I also want to thank NTIA, Scott, and also Derek for the opportunity to be here. I guess building off of the previous remarks, utilities love all, serve all. I mean, we're regulated because we actually have an obligation to serve. And that's where we're coming from in this panel in terms of our perspective. We have a need for reliability. And the way that utilities ensure reliability is through their communication networks. And so having reliable communications means reliable energy and also water services. And given the fact that so much is riding on utility services, which are essential to life and public safety, we think that we're pretty important in this discussion. So yes, thank you, Derek, for the opportunity to have this opening remarks to be able to explain where we're coming from in terms of what we're trying to do currently and where we see things going in terms of the collaborative process. And I will agree with Flynn. I think this is where the action is because a lot will depend on long-term planning. We can't continue to do things the way we've been doing things in the past. We need to have a methodical strategy. We need to bring all the stakeholders together, and that includes utilities and also other interested organizations and agencies that work with the energy sector and the water sector so that we can bring that perspective, we can inform the discussion. There are things going on in the policy realm that the communication sectors may not be aware of. And there are things, specifically that we're doing right now from a communication standpoint that are really innovative and exciting. So, we're facing a lot of challenges, right? I mean, John mentioned interference. Thank you for mentioning that. We're working on that, but we also have some serious concerns about the potential for interference, especially in that 6 gigahertz band, where we've got unlicensed operations that are now sharing with the utility fixed services, microwave systems in that band. At the same time that we're having to defend existing spectrum against interference, we're also having to go out and try and find additional spectrum because we've got all these new applications that are coming on, right? Smart grid, et cetera. At the same time, we also have to continue to maintain communications for mission critical, which includes voice communications with our crews out in the field. So how do we do that? And we're trying to basically explore opportunities to use various different spectrum bands for technologies that will provide not only backhaul communications like we're talking about in the 6 gigahertz band, where we might have to migrate to the 7 gigahertz to be able to get away from interference, but we also need to find additional spectrum for higher capacity wide area coverage. And there we're looking at the spectrum in the 400 megahertz range, potentially, as one federal band that could support private LTE to provide that additional capacity and coverage that we're going to be able to need to be able to support all these new applications that are coming online, and also make our systems that more resilient, because we're facing also challenges against external threats, whether it's hurricanes and wildfires, or whether it's man-made threats, cybersecurity, physical threats, attacks on substations. All these things are coming together. And so from a timing standpoint, this is the right time. And I really do appreciate having the opportunity for utilities to be able to participate in this process, because we need to find a way to support utility communications in all these new challenges that are coming online. And I think the National Spectrum Strategy has got it right, in the sense that a collaborative process that includes all the stakeholders, especially and including utilities and critical infrastructure, is the way to go. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Appreciate it. Mary.
Well, Derek, thank you for inviting me, and thank you in particular for inviting me to panel 2. I agree this is where the action is. So no surprise to anybody here, right? Wi-Fi is the enabling technology that sits at the edge of all of our broadband networks, regardless of what those broadband networks are, whether they're DOCSIS or fiber or fixed wireless access or satellite. It's Wi-Fi sitting at the edge. And, a few facts just to remind you. Wi-Fi is expected to contribute almost $1.6 trillion to the U.S. economy by 2025. We have over 80,000 unique devices that have been certified through the Wi-Fi Alliance. And we have just launched at Consumer Electronics Show the 7th generation of Wi-Fi, which is a very exciting, revolutionary new technology that will be wending its way into the market starting this year. So against this highly dynamic and very successful backdrop, I will say the Wi-Fi industry is enthusiastically embracing the spectrum policy planning process launched by the strategy. We see this debate as one that is highly relevant to our industry's ability to continue to be the critical link between broadband services and consumer and enterprise devices at the edge in the years ahead. And we also think we have something of value to add to this process. Fundamentally, Wi-Fi is a technology that was born into sharing, right? In the original 2.4 gigahertz band, Wi-Fi had to come in an unmanaged environment and share with other unlicensed devices. So the technology was specifically set up for sharing. When we got to the 5 gigahertz band, we had a collaborative process with our friends at the Department of Defense and some other agencies to talk about how Wi-Fi could share with government radars, and that was successfully concluded, enabling Wi-Fi to enter the 5 gigahertz band. And now, of course, we've had the 6 gigahertz band decision, which involves sharing with microwave users that Brett represents, as well as satellite users. So if this new process is well executed, and if NTIA imposes the discipline of actually getting to recommendations to deliver to our friends at the FCC, this has the promise, in our view, to do a couple of things. First, enabling an engineering-first discussion around coexistence issues that may, if it's a happy day, lead to consensus, and if not, at least our experience in the 6 gigahertz band, at least narrow or illuminate what the differences are, right? We're not gonna get consensus in every debate. The second thing it will do is it will front load that coexistence discussion with the hoped for outcome that the FCC can then move a little bit faster in its rulemaking processes than it has been able to in the past. So we're very excited and we're grateful to be here. Derek, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Tom?
Thank you, Derek. And, pretty good job on my name. Pretty good job, I got to say. Nicely
Thanks for the
done.
coaching.
Thank you for the invite and for having us here. We're a sister agency within the Department of Commerce, so we work well together. We work closely and often meet. We have I think, monthly meeting, Charles, where we meet with between the agencies. We have our discussions. So this is definitely part of that and broadening that. For those that heard NOAA, we're the weather people, right? But we're a little bit more than that. We support public safety. We see changes in the environment and the climate and more extreme weather events happening, more tornadoes, hurricanes, more intensifying hurricanes. And so what we do is we provide a fleet of satellites that have the observational capability to support the weather predictive models and climate forecasting. We also have terrestrial radars. Those colorful plots that you see on your phone when you pull up the weather, that's supported by us, that's provided, those colorful plots by us. We have this new, maybe not new, but this thing that we're calling new space weather, right? And there was a big topic on that at the ITU recently. With the more and more advent of the new frontier, as it were, we provide space weather predictions and warnings. And that's used, I believe, by the utilities as well. I think the FERC has a requirement to track that. I believe FAA uses that as well as we're working with NASA on those for when we launch people to the moon and satellites, right? There's impact from space weather on many aspects of the space economy. And so we provide warnings and predictions for all of that. But we do more than that as well. We have fisheries. And when Flynn was mentioning the fish analogy, I was like, fisheries, yes, right? And so we have a fleet of NOAA Core ships that also use Spectrum to communicate. They have radars to make sure that they don't run into anything. We have buoys that track our coastal areas. And so we do, Spectrum is pervasive throughout NOAA. We're called the weather people, but at the end of the day, when somebody pulls up the weather app and says, yeah, why does no one need Spectrum? I just look at the weather app on my phone, and that's where I get my weather. That's fed through some of, if not all of the observational data that we get through NOAA. And so Spectrum is important. I think one of the, to me, certainty around access to Spectrum is important for us. Some of our satellites are up there for 15, 20 plus years, right? And knowing that we'll have access to that spectrum to make those observations and then send that data back into the model is critical. And so planning for that is critical. And that's why we're here, and that's why we need a process for long-term planning. If we keep changing this every 3 or 4 years, then our satellites will have to continually be updated. And I don't know about you, but we haven't figured out a way to pluck a satellite out of the air yet and change things. So that long-term planning is important for us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And appreciate the breadth of comments here. I think it, as I said up front, kind of represents a real diversity in spectrum views and different perspectives. And, I think exemplifies this demand for spectrum that are often competing, sometimes complementary. And again, this is only a sampling. And I think Mary started to touch on this a little bit, but the strategy, again, recognizes that, we need this new and improved framework for increasing this collaboration. And this is public and private stakeholders for this better long-term planning. And everyone said they agree with that. Sounds good. But, maybe to start putting a little more, meat on the bones, what does it mean? Why is it important? What maybe are some elements that we should start thinking about and what this framework might look like? And I'm happy to just throw it open this time to anyone who wants to take a first stab.
I'll jump in.
Sure.
So, I've emphasized the word inclusion, right? I mean, that's because so much of what utilities do on a daily basis isn't necessarily recognized in the spectrum conversation. To the extent that, the collaborative framework can actually include all the stakeholders, and it's definitely made that clear in terms of the National Spectrum Strategy. I think that's a good thing. What does that look like specifically? We would like to see actually not only have all the folks at the table, from an energy and water standpoint, but also, we want to try and create potentially opportunities within CSMAC, for example, where industry stakeholders could actually work within working groups to try and bring in their perspective and then bring that out to the entire CSMAC as a group. That might actually provide even greater opportunities for that input from the utility sector to back into the larger communications conversation that's going to be taking place through CSMAC, through IRAC, and through the Interdepartment Spectrum Advisory Council. All these groups, collectively working together, I think, can actually move the needle on this. And the fact that the collaborative framework talks about long-term spectrum planning using evidence-based decision-making, those are really loaded terms. And I think everybody needs to recognize that there are important things that we actually need to follow rather than just, pay lip service to. Thanks.
Yeah. I would note that I'm excited from the Hill perspective that the hope is that, to use Mary's term, front load, that collaboration happens right out of the get-go. So that on the Hill, we're not having industries or agencies going to their respective committees of jurisdiction and saying, I don't like this, you got to throw it out and start from scratch. But rather that together we can establish consensus assumptions, methodology, things we all care about from the front end. And I think that will go a long way toward ensuring more sustainable decisions. That's our hope.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Flynn and Brett said. And, just to put a little bit more meat on the bone, some of the things, obviously successful collaboration is based on trust. And some of the specific things that would need to get nailed down to effectuate this evidence-based analysis to determine whether spectrum can be used more efficiently and effectively, include, can the incumbent operations be protected when new uses are introduced? What levels of noise cause the incumbents to be repeatedly interrupted? And are there things that can be done to victim receivers to protect them more, to make them more robust? We should also learn from the mistakes in the past. There are many teachings from the recent fiasco, the C-band interference or alleged interference to radio altimeters and how that was worked out. But on the positive side, all of the work that the government did to enable white spaces for in the broadcast bands has informed the 6 gigahertz operations, the 6 gigahertz automated frequency coordination system that is enabling, will soon enable, standard power Wi-Fi operations outdoors. That is a very positive outcome. But this is just the beginning. When you take a spectrum analyzer and you look at any band, in general, you see that there's a lot of opportunity for more intensive spectrum use. And the question is, how do we do that? And if everyone works from the same engineering baseline of knowledge, I think there's a lot that can be done. And it is still very early regarding, we still use the spectrum that is available a lot less than it can be. And I think that that's a great opportunity for all of us. But in order to make it work, we really need to start with a level of trust and a level of openness.
So I want to endorse what John just said and say the challenge for NTIA is going to be focusing those conversations around the coexistence topic, around the actual, can 2 radio systems occupy the same radio spectrum? And I have I have been around these issues long enough to have seen this play out 3 times. The first was in 5 gigahertz, where it played out to industry's great satisfaction that our federal colleagues did agree that dynamic frequency selection technology in Wi-Fi radios could protect them from harmful interference. One, where industry had to walk away, that we could not come up with a practical way, a way that would work within the business case to solve issues, and in this case it was aeronautical radar. So one where we had to walk away, and one, as I said, in the 6 gigahertz context, where we illuminated the issues, but we were not able to reach consensus. Ultimately, the FCC resolved that question. But it is very important to, as John says, focus on the engineering questions first. I think that doing so, even if you're not ultimately successful in reaching a consensus, it does provide a forum for meaningful data to be exchanged, for misinformation to be replaced with improved understandings, and potentially identify new opportunities down the road. So in addition to sort of thinking about how do we continue to advance sharing techniques, the U.S. leads the world right now. It'd be great to stay ahead of that game as we go forward.
Thank you. I think I echo everything that was said. Open dialogue, understanding is even more important, right? Willingness to listen and understand. Sharing ideas, right? The more siloed we are, the worse we are, right? And so I think having that open dialogue, creating open dialogue through engagements, and sometimes those engagements may need to be not open to the public for proprietary information or security information and things like that, but open dialogue is really important so that we understand not only the potential new uses, but what's existing and how, for instance, for us, how we support the public through weather predictions, right? And so we may not understand each other now, but I think that open dialogue would help us understand each other and help us move forward for a mutual solution, as it were.
I think that's a really good point. You know, willingness to listen and understanding everyone's perspectives. So, you know, we can talk all day about interference from a technical standpoint, but if there are lives on the line, and there are, because of interference to those utility communication systems, we're going to be pretty insistent that, you know, the high standards that those communication systems are designed and operate to are maintained. You can't fix problems after the fact. This is not your ordinary unlicensed type of situation. These are mission critical communications. I mean, there are all kinds of catastrophic consequences that can happen because of what, you know, may be considered ordinary garden variety interference to some, but not to utilities. And so there needs to be a willingness to come to the table, understand, and try and work these issues out. And we did our level best to try and work those issues out. We conducted our own studies, went out and bought equipment on our own. And those studies we submitted back to the FCC, and we're still trying to get some resolution in terms of what we believe is a really significant widespread problem of interference that's going to take place in the 6 gigahertz band. If we can't resolve that, we're going to have to basically find ways to migrate some of those links out of the 6 gigahertz band, and the 7 gigahertz band is really the next best lifeboat for utilities. Thanks.
Thank you, bro. A lot of good perspectives there. You know, one of the things I'm hit with is this idea of engineering principles or a framework that has some general applicability across spectrum bands. But as Brett pointed out, part of our challenge, I think, is not every band and every situation is going to be the same. So that's I think one challenge we face is how do you come up with something that's enduring across bands and at the same time, you know, is flexible enough to accommodate the uniqueness in that particular situation. Brett, you touched on, some of you guys talked about this a little bit, you touched on CSMAC as a possible vehicle. Mary, I may ask you to comment there, having years of experience with CSMAC. And thank you very much for your service. Tom, you talked about the different stakeholders that NOAA may have and the weather enterprise. What are more sort of maybe concrete ways we can expand this collaboration? I know we're not going to have all the answers today, but again, I think as we NTIA put together this implementation plan and we think this out, and even beyond the implementation plan into action plans for how we execute. CSMAC, for example, in fact, our application window for the next cycle just closed yesterday. We'll be hopefully standing that up by this summer. So I would expect we will be tasking CSMAC to look into some of these questions and maybe set something up. But again, kind of throwing that open for some more thoughts.
Sure, I'd be happy to take it as a CSMAC veteran. The concerns that we've heard, and we heard it on panel 1, we've heard it here on panel 2, is the time to get this collaborative process and study process underway. Everyone's feeling the pressure to come up with a plan and start executing on the plan. So in light of that, I think the better part of valor would be for NTIA to build on what you guys already have. And what you have is a lot, right? You have the IRAC, and you have CSMAC, you have other ways in which to get information from stakeholders. The CSMAC, I think, is a particularly good example because you are already stood up with a federal advisory committee. That approval's been in place for many years. You have very tried and true processes around that. It's proven to be not just an information gathering group, but an informed information gathering group. You've chosen well for the people who are on it, and it provides real value add reporting process, I think, out to you on the questions that you give it. I also noted, I just took a look yesterday, that it is possible, although CSMAC hasn't done this, for an advisory committee to handle national security information. That is something that could be done. The drawback, of course, is that it's 30 members. So those 30 members are not going to represent all the stakeholders, and they're not going to bring the level of technical expertise to the table. So clearly, I think Brett's suggestion of subcommittees that move to a larger community around different bands or different questions that you might pose is the way to go. And I would think from a speed to market perspective, that would be something that should interest the NTIA in doing.
Thank you.
So the first thing is I'd say the process that NTIA has taken to get to the National Spectrum Strategy is a good start, right? All of the public engagements that NTIA has had, both with the public and with the federal agencies, right? Inclusion, I think, is the key word here. Getting a perspective from all stakeholders. And as you mentioned, some of the existing fora are good and they serve a good purpose. I think some of them may be useful and extended. CSMAC is sort of limited. As you mentioned, it also can't handle certain types of information. Typically, proprietary information or sensitive information can't be shared through a FACA type process. And so that limits some of what it can do. I think recently we've seen more academic interest in spectrum policy, and Spectrum X has been critical in helping that. And so there are other forums that can also support this. I don't really have an answer for you, but I think inclusion and opening the aperture to non-traditional spectrum consumers, as it were, and spectrum users is really part of it. We work with cooperative institutes, universities, to help us develop new weather models, and they also require access to the data and the spectrum that we have. How do we include them in the conversation? It's a question I don't have an answer to yet, but I'm sure in the development of this Pillar 2, those are some of the things we should consider and take into account.
I would also add, in addition to the long-established groups like CSMAC, we need to use the pillars and guidance of these documents to inform some of the more ad hoc work. I think of what was done in the past classified subgroup, that the information sharing and inclusiveness that clearly this panel thinks is a good thing is earnestly interpreted and put into effect as we do some of the work of Panel 1.
One of the other things that I would add to that is, I agree with everything that's been said, is a lot of the work within the federal advisory committees is done by working groups, and it's important to have the appropriate people staffing those working groups that are consensus builders, not obstructionists, but doers. That is a very important piece of the puzzle so that this work can proceed apace. You want folks that are going to engage based on science and not be there to basically prevent progress.
I'll just, wrap up in terms of where we began. Having a special group that can actually identify respective interests within the CSMAC, I think, will be an efficient way of actually conducting business. But there's other things we have to do, and they're more fundamental. We have to change the way we think about spectrum, right? In the metrics that we use to measure how we're actually achieving what we're setting out to do within the National Spectrum Strategy. And so much is quantitative, right? And that's understandable. But there are certain things that deliver value back to society as a whole. So there's a qualitative element that we need to recognize, and we need to find a way to include that in terms of the discussion that's going to be taking place. I don't think we need to go out and necessarily create new structures to be able to support what we're doing. Those existing groups like CSMAC will actually be able to get the job done. I'm afraid that we will lose time if we try and do something different. But it's important within the federal ranks, as Tom was saying, to have that conversation, with DOE and those other agencies that are, involved, so that if there is sensitive information, that there is that, cross-pollinization that's taking place, and everybody's at the table, and they're all understanding and working together towards an objective that isn't necessarily focused on just commercial spectrum, right? There are other national security issues out there. And so, we need to maintain our leadership in the world, for sure. And one way to do that is to be able to, recognize that there are other uses of spectrum besides commercial that matter. And utilities is one example of that, because it basically does protect critical infrastructure.
Thank you. No, that's great. And I appreciate, too, Tom, the nod on the process with the NSS. There were, as we developed this, there were some new things for NTIA, too. Like, we're not the FCC, and we don't have the electronic comment filing system and all the filings. And we, not only posting comments, we received RFCs, but we started to have meetings, and we started to ask parties to give us meeting summaries and post those online. So I think maybe we're entering a new era of where that sort of public information is made available as well, too. Again, not being an agency that runs, proceedings per se like the FCC. So I think that's one step forward. We talked about we want the science and the data to win, right? We need evidence-based decision making, and I kind of think of two things. We talked a little bit of how we get this data, how we make these exchanges, and I'll point out it's we want data on current and future spectrum requirements, current and future spectrum needs, and this is both from the federal government and the private sector. So I think we've talked a little bit about that. Anything more if folks want to add on that is great. And then secondly, that's getting the data, and then how the government best uses it, right? So I mean, is it reasonable to think that we can collectively do a better job to advance the state of the art in these the spectrum compatibility studies, right? That are used both, I'd say, domestically, internationally. We're already launching a new WRC cycle for 27. Historically, a lot of times, spectrum issues have become a game of competing studies, right? So, how do we take the data? How do we, as we talked about up front, come to where we can get more close to consensus on what the inputs are into a study, right? Because if we can do that, then you're less arguing about the results, because hopefully everyone's running it. If you get the parameters consistent, then you end up results. So kind of again throwing it out there. I know we're kind of talked about this a little bit, but any more thoughts folks have would be great.
One thing in the presidential memorandum that caught my eye immediately was toward the back end was making clear that when NTIA requests data, there's an obligation to provide that data when it's talking about long-term spectrum uses, mission-critical operation, things of that nature. While I think that collaboration was happening, coming from the president to say, for the NTIA to satisfy its statutory obligation, it must be furnished with the data it needs to do that job. I think that's a good thing, because we want NTIA to be an emboldened advocate for federal missions. That's why it exists in large measure. And so I view this not as big bad NTIA knocking on the door for data, but rather agencies giving their advocate the tools it needs to do its job. And while that's not getting as much attention, as I say, Panel 1 has really exciting bands and stuff like that. That just, I think, is such an important part of how we keep the cogs turning. And so I just wanted to note, I think that's going to be a foundational part of how we move forward.
In addition to that, I would just add, I agree with wholeheartedly, is some level of real-world testing. One of the dark sides of that is, one of the strategies is to just test something to death, right? Keep testing it. You need a 36-month testing plan. But to learn, one of the biggest impacts is on what is causing interference. Can that be changed to modify whatever waveform it's using to be less offensive? Also, are there ways to improve the potential victims? Move to a different band, use less spectrum, but looking at that to actually see, does the system actually stop working? Or does it maybe work a little less than you would in a perfectly clear channel? All of these need to be important, and I also agree with what Brett said. It's important to look at the victims and to understand that when certain systems go down, yeah, it's a bigger problem than if your kid's toy stops operating for a half a second because of some blip of noise. I mean, that is super important to look at what does the interference cause, and then what are ways of preventing that to the extent, lives are at risk. A car is going to crash. I mean, all of that is part of the calculus. But, that being said, there's a lot of communications that if it's delayed by a second, half a second, you get a text message 4 seconds later, so what, right? But if it's life-threatening message, you want that to be able to go through. So, I think that is a key element, but you don't want to get into a situation where you need more testing and testing and testing and testing, and then whatever you were trying to enable just falls by the wayside because it was essentially tested to death.
So, what this boils down to is trust. Right? We're talking about data, but, do you believe the data, right? Or are you willing to share the data? And so there needs to be some level of trust that's reestablished. And I think we can do that. SISMAC is actually a good vehicle to try and reestablish that. The collaborative framework, I think, if we follow it to the letter, will actually succeed. But yeah, we were talking about studies. Utilities were actually conducting real-world studies, in the 6 gigahertz band. And then we were having to use those studies to basically question the validity of models. And so while we were actually providing all that data, the models that we were having to contest basically weren't disclosing any. We didn't get the data, we didn't get the algorithms that were being fed into those models. There needs to be some openness when these studies are submitted, so that we have trust that the conclusions that are being reached are repeatable, and that's probably one other thing I would say in terms of the conversation around data. there needs to be some verification of some of these studies.
Go ahead.
I guess I'll jump in to Flynn's point. I think data is important. I think data from all stakeholders, though, is the key word. Getting data from one half of the equation gives you one half of the equation, right? And so being able to compare and ensure that we get data from all stakeholders, or NTIA gets data from all stakeholders, that's the key word, that's the key piece here. You know, we can gather all the data we have, at least from NOAA, right? But what do you compare that to? What do you measure that against? What do you calculate that against? That's the other side of the coin that we need to keep in mind. And so that, you know, data collection is very important, but data collection from all stakeholders is important.
No, I think it's a good point, Tom, and something I don't have to tell you that I think NTIA struggle with, right? Because that is a challenging problem. I think, Mary, were you going to?
Well, I was just going to say, I continue to believe that technical questions around coexistence and understanding when you've produced harmful interference and when you haven't continues to be at the core of this. There are, of course, a swirl of other issues around the question of how does NTIA make a recommendation for a particular band, right? And those may be less technical than a coexistence debate. So it's, you know, if we don't have X in the band, if we don't have Wi-Fi in the band or 5G in the band, what are the consequences of that? What are the opportunity costs of that? That's not really a technical question. That's going to be one that's going to have to be resolved. Is there a business case, right, for the commercial thing that's trying to enter a federal band? I saw some of my FCC friends earlier today. You know, in the 6 gigahertz band, the power levels on Wi-Fi are 4 times less than what they are in the 5 gigahertz band. That is like a very low power level, and that was done deliberately by FCC staff to protect incumbents, right? So could we live with that? We answered yes, we could, right? But if it had been, say, substantially lower, if it had been 8 times, the answer might have been different, right? So you have to have this layer of, is what you're doing from a coexistence perspective, is it going to result in meaningful use of the spectrum, understanding when that might happen, understanding a little bit about standards and technology development and all those things that kind of swirl around this, where there are probably, just judging from panel 1 and a little bit here on panel 2, there's going to be, you know, credible differences of opinion, right? So NTIA is going to have to find a way to cut that Gordian knot at the end of the day. This is not just a technical debate.
Very, very good point, and I think we do want this collaboration to have those conversations as well too, and that is that's a national level conversation, and it involves everyone, FCC, Congress, right, administration. So very good point. I'm happy to open up to any questions from the audience. I think if we have any, or I'll keep going. But I think we do have a hand up.
Armand Musi from Summit Ridge Group. So I think I've heard like 3 major themes this morning. One is that speed is of the essence. The second is that the challenges of freeing up additional spectrum are much more complicated going forward because of incumbent users. And the third is that when thinking about this, we need to consider all different views, more views than in the past, and potentially consider more data than in the past. And how do we avoid that turning into just a bureaucratic train wreck, and maybe looking like the European space sector, which is totally stalled and has been taken over by SpaceX?
Yeah, I'll certainly open up to anyone. I will say you captured a big reason why I think we do have Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, because we knew we needed to move on some things in Pillar 1 while we worked on Pillar 2 to kind of address that issue a little bit there.
I'll take a crack. You know, Armand, good to see you again. You know, the The first 5G bands were opened in 2015, 2016, and Qualcomm knew that opening up spectrum for 5G Advanced and 6G was going to take some time, and for that reason, we took the time element to heart and actually began working on looking at spectrum bands, and particularly identified the 7 to 15 gigahertz band as prime 6G spectrum back in late 2021. It was in 2022 at Mobile World Congress that FCC Chair Rosenworcel specifically identified that spectrum for 6G, roughly 8 years prior to when it's going to be deployed. So one of the things that we took to heart is we know it's not getting any easier, so allocating that additional time to work on that in a very serious way was one of the ways, at least one of the things that we decided to actively do, and I think part of that work is reflected in the National Spectrum Strategy, which identifies, bands in this range that are going to be important. But this isn't easy, and it's going to take time, and hopefully if we could put into practice all of the good words you've heard on this panel and you're going to hear today, I think we have a good shot.
I would just say in Congress we like to think statute is important, and all of these documents, thank you for the laugh. All of these documents, I think, tend to buttress the existing statutory obligations of the respective agencies. When we honor those statutory obligations, I think the decision-making process is a little cleaner. It's not as Jackson Pollock as we've seen it of late. And I think honoring statutory roles of agencies buttresses their job and makes cleaner decision-making processes. I'd also say we haven't really talked about procurement much, but as we move away from sort of this greenfield world, I think we have to start making little down payments for the future. Congresswoman Matsui in our NTIA Reauthorization Act included some language to study federal receiver performance. I think little things that we do now will yield huge dividends moving forward. So I think those two things are important.
Well, I don't work at the NTIA, so I don't have the problem of trying to implement this, but if I were there, what I would be thinking about is if I'm going to have a group of people, whether they're under the CSMAC or some other organization, I would be thinking about asking them highly specific questions and putting deadlines on that. I think we heard some of that in panel 1 as well, putting deadlines on those questions. Because those questions might turn out to be iterative, right? And we may learn as we go along. But I do think having a deadline and enforcing those deadlines makes people accountable and will keep the process moving forward. It is difficult, though. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to administer and a hard thing to manage. But that would be one approach I would use going in.
And I would just say, going back to Derek's comment that it's going to depend on the band, but there are probably some bands that are actually easier than others to try and share. So, if we can focus on those low-hanging fruits, I think we can actually achieve some really good wins in a quick, timely basis.
I think I'm going to refer to the title of the pillar that says long-term planning. So I think we can take some time to develop the process that we can use in long-term planning. While we do need to get that done soon, I'll leave soon a little bit open to interpretation, because this will be very important for all stakeholders, right? To have a consistent process and a clear process on how we're going to make these decisions moving forward. And I understand the bureaucratic aspect of it, but these are important decisions, and so we need to have a process that we can all agree to and be comfortable with.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Hi, I'm really intrigued about this notion of collaboration.
Sorry, Nick, can you
sorry.
introduce?
My name is Nick Lanneman. I'm faculty at Notre Dame. And I'm really intrigued about this broader topic of collaboration and long-term thinking. That suits academia quite well, as you can imagine. One question I have when I hear these conversations is there a way to start by collaboratively defining the problem and what is known about the problem before we launch a data collection effort, before we launch competing studies? Can we align around the actual crux of the problem in a band, either in band or adjacent band, to make sure that we understand what needs to be done to address that problem?
Great point.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think to some degree that work has already started. NTIA is taking comments on the strategy. They've taken comments on the implementation plan. Various industry players have come forward expressing an interest in one band or the other or in the long-term planning process. And I think that those record comments will go a long way toward having, if NTI does this, crystallizing the questions that need to be put in front of these groups, right? So some of that, I think, is already on the table, at least in terms of the bands that were identified in the pipeline in the strategy. On the longer term stuff, maybe less so, and so that your point, I think, on the longer term front is well taken.
Good question. Derek, what's the answer?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think Mary answered that well. I kind of think of that in two phases, right? Some of that is happening. I think there's a macro question there, and then I think your point is a little bit, if we are going to look at whether it's one of the current bands or a future band, identify that problem up front and come to some agreement, and then, yeah, then you move through the process, and then we talk about things like identifying what the studies might look like, what the assumptions are, and you go through it. But it's a good point. You want to actually know what you're debating or figuring out first, right? That's a
I
good
think
point.
we need to keep open minds too, right? I mean, because you may not need to do a complex dynamic spectrum sharing solution in one band versus another. And that will then allow some bands to be shared much more quickly if you don't have to go to the same exact type of technology solution in every single band.
All right, thank you. There's one.
Good morning. My name is Erik Wagner. I'm with the Utilities Technology Council, and I just wanted to say that I'm really encouraged by the focus on the importance of the stakeholders, and I really liked what Tomasz said. If you only have half the stakeholders giving their comments, then you only have half the information. And I think what happened and where the FCC broke down was they had all the stakeholder information, but they dismissed half of it. And I think that is an important part of the transparency process, that all the information is actually being considered and not just, rely on some information that is in a black box. Again, transparency. And I think I have high hopes that NTIA will lead that process in a much more transparent and open and productive manner. Thank you.
I just want to say I disagree with your characterization that the FCC dismissed certain studies. I believe the FCC reviews everything that's been filed carefully. They may place different weight on various studies, but I think saying it was dismissed is not accurate in my view.
So I will say that putting NTIA in that role of actually trying to, objectively look at various different spectrum uses, I think is a good thing, as far as the national spectrum strategy. I know that was said on the earlier panel, and I agree with it again here.
Thank you. Maybe what I'll do here is just sort of give everyone, this is sort of like a wild card, right? Maybe a wrap up here. I think we've pretty much covered the waterfront, and maybe in terms of thinking, as Tom said, I think it's going to be a little while before we perfect what this looks like from a collaboration framework. But I think we also are anxious to get a little bit started. So maybe, a little bit of, any summary you want to give, but also any, as we leave here today, what's something, you could tell NTIA to get working on? And I'd say more broadly the USG, right? It's not just NTIA, it's the agencies. We haven't talked a lot about the FCC. We've touched it a little bit, but they're a big partner to us in this, and we'll be very involved in all of this, right? So any sort of parting shots or thoughts you want to leave us with would be welcome. Then I'll just go down the row this time, give everyone a chance. John.
Why don't you start with Tom?
Still down the road.
I was hoping to go last so I could hear what the rest of the group had said and gather my thoughts. But, I want to appreciate being on the panel and the conversation, and I think that's ultimately what needs to continue is conversation. We have conversation all the time with our colleagues at NTIA, but conversation more broadly with the stakeholders, as it were, right? From our perspective, or from my perspective, I guess I should say, we serve the public, right, and the public interest. And so, in a way, we sort of have a conflict, right? We need spectrum for us, but we also want to support the Department of Commerce and their mission. So it needs to be sort of a balance, right? And the long-term strategy and the long-term process needs to take all of that into account and have that balance. A lot of things we don't think about, right? Like I said, we have a lot of spectrum use that people, I don't want to say dismiss, but don't know what it's used for. And that's the important piece, is also education. And I think, again, that's where maybe Spectrum X and the academia can come in and help us there, educating the public on the importance of spectrum and the long-term viability of some of this spectrum usage. So, not a bit rambling, but I think that's where I'll leave it.
So, 3 points. So, one, we haven't talked about, because the FCC isn't on the panel, but something the FCC needs to think about is, what does its spectrum policy mechanism mean when the NTIA hands off a recommendation to the FCC? Is it a business as usual rulemaking? Does the NTIA recommendation carry some kind of special weight? What are the processes that attach to that? And if there are any, maybe there's none. Maybe we're just going to run a rulemaking as usual. But I think the FCC should give some thought to that, number one. Number two, for all the stakeholders who are going to be participating in this, we need people in the room who understand the physical layer of radio networks. And sometimes for some user communities, that may mean they have to drag their vendors into the room, right? Sometimes not, but sometimes they do. And those are the people we really need to have in the coexistence conversations, because they really understand what will work or what won't work, right? What's going to cause harmful interference. And the third thing I would just say is pick some bands where you guys have a little bit of a head start. And I think panel one raised this, maybe James Assey raised this. There is already work that can be built on as a result of the paths process at 3.1 that could go forward. And there's some understanding, at least for the Wi-Fi potential use of the very lower part of 7, with the federal fixed links that occupy the lower part of 7. There's some FCC teachings from 6 that might be useful there. So pick some things where you can get, as we say, a quick win, or at least run the process, right? Get the process running and get a deadline associated with it. So I would say that those would be my concluding points. Thank you.
And I'm going to kind of echo what Tom was saying, first by saying thanks again. I mean, it really is great to see everyone here and also to have a voice in this conversation, because, not to complain, but utilities often do get overlooked in terms of the spectrum conversation. And we do provide public services. And, going to Flynn's comment in terms of how do you avoid conflicts, look to the statute, right? So there's actually language in the presidential memorandum that gave rise to the National Spectrum Strategy that talks about accounting for federal missions. And also one of those federal missions is protecting critical infrastructure. So if we use that and be mindful about that and be true to it, I think we can actually move forward on this. And so one of the things we've talked about is, the whole interference issue, right? I think that there's a way that we can actually come to some consensus around that issue. But we can't compromise when it comes to mission critical. There's got to be a recognition that that does affect critical infrastructure, which in turn affects those, essential public services that are being provided, whether it's by government or whether it's by utilities. And the last piece of it is, and we haven't had a really good conversation around this, there needs to be some kind of harmonization of spectrum policies. Utilities right now, they're all across the board because they have to basically work with what they can find. There needs to be, urban planning for spectrum. There has to be a process, and it has to make sense, and we have to work globally, not just, specifically within the United States. All that stuff, to the extent that we can actually tie together with the commercial marketplace, is good for everybody. So that would be my final comment. And actually, one last comment. We're not going to sit back and complain. We are going to basically become involved in CSMAC, all right? So, despite what others may think, utilities are actually engaging in this process. We are committed to communications. We just want to make sure that everybody else, gives us a voice at the table, and then also includes all the other stakeholders as well. Thanks.
I think maybe our conversation on panel 2 is a little more heady than panel 1, but I think we have such a unique opportunity, to Mary's point, to bring these ideas to life. And I think about some of the studies that are going to be coming out of the gates. On the Hill, we're really excited to see to what extent, every band is different, but to what extent will some of these studies right out of the gates set the tone for everything to come in the National Spectrum Strategy. I think about co-led studies in the lower 3 gigahertz. What does that mean? How is NTIA going to honor its statutory roles or express them within the confines of a National Spectrum Strategy? So we're really excited to see NTIA dive in, get to work, and ensure that these ideas set the tenor of those studies moving forward.
Thanks to NTIA for holding this panel. This has been a great panel. It's been a pleasure to participate. You've heard a lot about what needs to happen, and all I would say is let's get busy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, John. That's a great wrap-up. I always say, whew, a lot of information here, but I know I can speak for my colleagues that you all have given us a lot to really think about. Before we thank this group, and I don't know, you want to jump up here, Scott, or he does. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and thank the group, and then Scott will send us off to lunch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Derek, and thank all of you for participating. It's good to see you all. So, first, the question about how do we keep our, a great question, how do we keep our collaborative process from becoming an endless discussion group, which would not solve any problems? Take a look at the presidential memorandum. There's actually a dispute resolution mechanism built into it, a first-time new thing. And it just so happens we're going to talk about it at the last panel of the day. So, come back from lunch. The other reason you should come back from lunch is that we have a spectacular set of keynotes and panels. Arthi Prabhakar, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, John Sherman, the CIO of the Department of Defense, and Kathy McMorris-Rogers, who is the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, are all going to be giving keynotes this afternoon. Did I mention Spectrum is really hot these days? That's a hell of a panel, right? A hell of a set of keynotes. And then we're going to have panel discussions on the 3rd and 4th pillars of the strategy. And we're also going to have a discussion of the upcoming ISART conference from our colleagues at ITS in Boulder, Colorado. And finally, I will end it up talking about the presidential memorandum and other things with Austin Bonner of OSTP and Matt Pearl of the NSC. And if any of you come up with jokes, we'll do those then too. We'll now break for lunch. I urge you to come back if you can around 12:45 because our keynoters are really pressed for time and they're going to be right on time and ready to go. Thank you. See you soon.